What if the heavens opened in the stillness of night and the stars above whispered truths hidden since the beginning of time? Imagine lying under a sky so vast, so endless, that your heart begins to wonder if somewhere beyond those shining lights, mysteries wait to be uncovered. The night air is calm, the world around you quiet, and yet a question lingers softly in the mind. What would happen if angels descended and shared with mankind the secrets never meant to be known? The thought alone is enough to stir something deep inside. For as long as humans have walked upon the earth, they have looked upward, toward the sky, toward the stars, toward the unknown. The heavens have always seemed close and yet untouchable, a realm reserved for powers greater than ourselves. To dream of those gates opening, of a voice calling from beyond the clouds, is to feel the nearness of something far greater than ordinary life. Now picture a silent night, when the world lies still and the veil between earth and heaven feels thinner. The stars glimmer like watchful eyes, keeping secrets of ages past. The moon drifts slowly, its light falling across mountains, rivers, and sleeping villages. The night invites wonder, but it also stirs a question that refuses to fade. If angels walked among us, what would they say? Would they speak of creation, of hidden laws that bind the universe together? Would they tell of mysteries too heavy for human hearts? Or would they reveal forbidden things, truths that could change mankind forever? The thought grows heavier the more one considers it. Knowledge is light, but light can also burn. If man were to learn the things that belong only to heaven, would it not shape the course of history in ways unforeseen? The stars twinkle quietly, as if holding back their answer, refusing to let the secrets spill. Yet the imagination wanders freely, wondering about the mom, and when the unseen might touch the seen, when angels might draw back the veil. There is a stillness that comes when we dwell on such questions. The stillness of being caught between fear and longing. Fear because some knowledge might be dangerous. Longing because our hearts hunger for truth, for meaning beyond the fleeting shadows of our days. To imagine the heavens opening is to imagine a world no longer ordinary. It is to imagine the voice of the eternal entering into the quiet moments of human life. And so, the story begins here, with a simple, haunting question under the stars. A question that does not let go. What if the heavens opened and angels came not only to comfort or to guide, but to reveal? And what if what they revealed was never meant for human ears? The stillness of night holds the weight of that thought, as if the universe itself pauses to listen. This is where our journey starts, a story of mysteries, of hidden things, of knowledge that was once whispered long ago. It is a story that stretches across the ages, touching the lives of men and women who wondered, who searched, and who sometimes received more than they could bear. As the stars continue their quiet watch, the mind cannot help but drift deeper into that dream, the dream of a sky split open with revelation. Before we step further, I want to pause and invite you to join me on this entire journey. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means more than you know. Share this video with your friends so they too can wonder about these mysteries with us. And tell me in the comments, from which city and at what time are you watching tonight? Write your name and your city below, and let's see how far across the world this story can reach. And if your heart longs to read these sacred writings for yourself, you'll find links waiting in the description. There you can explore the complete Book of Enoch, 1, 2, 3, and the Ethiopian Bible with all 88 books, treasures of ancient wisdom preserved through time. Step into the words, and let them speak to you as they have to generations before us. May Jesus bless you and reward you for being part of this journey. A group of creatures known as the Watchers existed long before human kingdoms came and went, and before languages split the planet. They were chosen angels with a unique role. They were not your typical angels. They occupied an honorable and significant position near the border between heaven and earth. These guardians were tasked with monitoring the order of creation, keeping an eye on human children, and making sure that the Most High's intentions were carried out on earth. Their very name conveyed a sense of alertness. They were observers, people who saw, understood, and looked. These were positioned lower, close to the boundary where heaven met the human world, while other angels moved in splendor among the heights. Their task was to meticulously document everything that transpired under the sun, and their eyes and spirits were trained to notice and discern. Being selected as a watcher meant being entrusted with a duty that bound them to the precarious existence of humanity rather than being free. Why would they be sent so near to Earth? The mystery of human destiny holds the solution. Despite its frailty, humanity possessed a spark of divine intention. Men and women were created to exist, develop, thrive, and procreate, and the course of history depended heavily on their story. However, humanity was also susceptible to violence, corruption, and forgetting the God who gave them life. As protectors of that thin line, the Watchers were positioned close, by. Their purpose was not to rule. They did not rule humanity as kings or lords. They were sent to guard, to lead when allowed, and to maintain the harmony between the freedom of the earth and the order of heaven. Their goal was care, not power. They were designed to keep the world of men on course and unaffected by the mayhem that threatened to burst from the darkness. Picture them coming down in subdued light, dressed in the glory of their position, invisible to most but never far from sight. Perched atop mountains, they had a view of valleys where rivers flowed. They guarded cities while elders narrated stories beneath the stars, children played in courtyards, and fires blazed in hearths. Their watch was not lighthearted, rather it was solemn, as if their charge were the echo of every human heartbeat. These angels were not chosen at random. They were chosen due to their strength, loyalty, and capacity to watch for an extended period of time without interfering. Being a watcher meant living in silence, accepting patience as a mantle, and only acting when directed. Since not all wisdom was intended to be shared, they were instructed to keep the knowledge of the heavens to themselves. The Watchers stood precisely on the thin line that separated the divine from the human. Nevertheless, their proximity to humanity served as both a challenge and an honor. They observed humanity up close rather than from afar. They witnessed men's everyday hardships, hunger and labor, familial ties, the warmth of love, and the pain of loss. They learned more about the ways of flesh and blood the longer they were close. Slowly, what started out as observation turned into emotion. Their hearts sagged toward the earth where heaven had demanded separation. But they had a clear mission. Their purpose was to safeguard. They were to provide restrained guidance. They were to watch history unfold and bring the testimony of what happened below to God's throne. Their existence demonstrated that heaven cared for humanity and that the eternal still's eyes were on them. The Watchers were aware of how serious their charge was. They were aware of their selection. Not all angels could stand being so close. Some were too holy, too fierce, or too ensnared in the heavenly fire to hang around with people. However, the Watchers possessed a special fortitude that allowed them to stand between two worlds without cracking. They could maintain their position of obedience while staring at man's frailty. That was the hope, anyway. Because every mission from heaven comes with a secret test. In addition to protecting humanity, the Watchers were sent to demonstrate their own loyalty. Would they continue to obey orders to observe and refrain from interfering? Would they resist the temptation to divulge the secrets of heaven? Would they respect the distinction between the temporal and the eternal? Or would their proximity to humans lead them down a path that was not intended for them? It was a dangerous and glorious mission, because the same intimacy that allowed them to understand could also arouse desire. Furthermore, unbridled longing may result in decisions that alter the destiny of both heaven and earth. The Watchers took up their stations, dispersed throughout the planet as gleaming beings that mortals could not see. They observed the changing of the seasons and the emergence and demise of generations. They watched as homes were constructed, fields were planted, and the first outlines of cities began to take shape. As instructed, humanity was expanding, spreading, and occupying the land. The Watchers watched in silence, waiting, recording. Their mission was clear, and their task was noble. However, as the years went by and they continued to observe humanity, something inside of them started to stir, something for which no command had prepared them. It was still the beginning of a question rather than disobedience or rebellion. Their proximity, empathy, and extended observation under the stars gave rise to this query. The mountain towered, its ridges reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels. With its peaks shrouded in floaty clouds and its slopes weighed down by silence, Mount Hermon had always been a mysterious place. A gathering unlike any other took place here, in the silent vastness where earth and sky met. The Watchers had gathered beneath the shadow of its heights, no longer satisfied with their silent duty. Their chosen leader, Semjaza, stood in the middle of their group, his presence a source of both confidence and anxiety. The silence of the night was broken by his deep, authoritative voice. He spoke as someone who had already made a decision, not as someone who was unsure. He told them about his desire and the stirring inside of him that he was unable to suppress. They were drawn to humanity because of its beauty, vitality, and potential. This fascination was accompanied by a desire that hinted at intimacy, social interaction, and moving past the role of passive observers. However, Semjaza's words were hesitant, even as he acknowledged his intention. He was aware of how serious such a decision was. A barrier established by the Most High had to be crossed in order to fully descend among humanity. It was rebellion, not a mere act of curiosity, and he was afraid of the burden that came with making such a choice by himself. As he looked around the crowd, he noticed that everyone was silent, and their faces were illuminated by stars. "I will bear the penalty for everyone if I bear this alone," he declared. He pushed against their hesitancy, urging a perilous unity, saying, "But if we bind ourselves together, if we are united, then we will stand as one and none will falter in fear." He was requesting an oath, not just agreement. The Watchers shifted, caught between the fire that was growing inside them and their duty to their charge. They had stared at men's children for so long. They had witnessed their hardships, joy, warmth, and grief. As they watched, their desire to participate, shape, and touch grew stronger. Semjaza's words ignited a secret fire within each of them. The leader then made the irrevocable suggestion. They would take a binding oath on this mountain, far above the world below. Since the choice would be finalized among all of them, nobody would back down or cower in terror. That night they made a covenant based on defiance rather than light. Together, their voices rose, solemn and determined, promising to follow the same course. So the Watchers sealed their vow under the wide sky. Each raised their voices, resonating into the quiet, their words resonating across the slopes like whispers. They pledged to themselves that no one would back down. They were bound together in a chain of resolve by their heavy oath, which bound them spirit to spirit. With its silent yet resilient stones, Mount Hermon became the witness, preserving the memory of their disobedience. Because they had sworn and cursed themselves there with their vow, it was said that the mountain was named after this exact oath. When they stopped talking, the decision became a fate rather than a thought. Once guardians, the Watchers had stepped into their own shadow. Their descent was now a march toward fulfillment rather than a hesitancy. As they descended from the heights where they had lingered for ages, the air became heavier. In order to walk among those they had chosen to join, they descended not in the splendor of their former glory, but rather in a form more like that of men. As their brightness faded and their presence changed, They completely crossed the line and set foot on Earth as participants rather too, Han observers. Their feet touched the ground one after the other, and the oath they had taken grew stronger with each step. They were no longer watchers in the traditional sense. No longer were they merely the eyes of heaven. They had transformed into something completely different. Angels who had experienced the excitement of freedom and made the decision to live a life that was not intended for them. What had happened on the heights of Hermon was unknown to the world of men. Unaware that beings from the heavens had taken an oath above them, the people below continued living their lives as usual. Families continued to gather, songs continued to reverberate in the night, and fires continued to burn in the hearths. But above it all, invisible, the Watchers moved closer, bearing hunger, secrets, and the start of a tale that would change the world forever. With a determined expression on his face, Semjaza walked at their head. Those who had committed themselves to his cause were gathered around him, their unity now cemented. They were no longer distant observers. Instead, they were rebellious brothers who entered the lives of the very creatures they had been tasked with defending. Their descent was marked by a quiet gravity, a change in the invisible fabric of the world rather than thunder or storm. Earth would soon bear the consequences of the deliberate piercing of heaven. The Watchers had gone too far. They had committed to a new course, and knowledge, temptation, and a series of repercussions that neither heaven nor earth could ignore would follow from that commitment. Mount Hermon, the keeper of a secret vow that reverberated through the ages, stood silently, its stones bearing witness. The earth appeared to sleep beneath the silent cover of night, oblivious to the eyes that now gazed upon it yearningly. Their oath on Mount Hermon weighed heavily on the Watchers, who had once been luminous guardians set above the world, but had now ventured into forbidden territory. They were no longer restricted to merely watching. Instead, they allowed their hearts to follow long-sparked desires. They saw daughters of flesh and blood, women who embodied the warmth of families, the beauty of life, and the laughter of innocence, among the fields and among the houses of men. Although these daughters lacked the radiance of heaven, their grace was unique, unvarnished, and profoundly human. The Watchers were captivated by that distinction. Curiosity quickly gave way to desire. Where they ought to have looked away, their eyes lingered. They observed the cadence of everyday existence, the weaving of textiles, the songs sung to children, the delight of drinking water from wells, and the assembly of families in the evening light. Even though these actions lacked any celestial or angelic grandeur, their very simplicity spoke to the Watchers in a way that heaven's boundless splendor never could. They desired intimacy, touch, and bonds that were not intended for them, not the splendor of the stars or the boundless skies. Even though that beauty shone in their eyes, it was not the only thing that attracted them to men's daughters. It was also the warmth of mortality, the life they held, and the frail yet valuable essence of being a human. Angels were aware of eternity, but it was devoid of urgency and transient sweetness. Time was always pressing down on humanity, and because of this transience, passion, love, and familial ties were born. Having watched it all from afar, the Watchers now desired to enter it and take what had never been given to them. However, their desire was sincere. It was neither blessed by heaven nor molded by the Most High's order. Their oath gave them the courage to act as their desire turned into hunger. They were looking for a secret bond, a taking rather than a giving, a union of rebellion rather than holiness. These celestial creatures, who ought to have protected humanity, started claiming the daughters of the earth as their own. Their leader, Semjaza, had cautioned them on the mountain that some might falter out of fear, but the fire within their hearts was too great. They pursued men's daughters one after another, disguising their genius and taking on forms that could move through fields and villages. Their presence was intriguing despite being odd and unnerving. Men were uneasy, but the daughters were captivated, ensnared in the enigma of these strangers who had an unearthly presence in their eyes. What started out as whispers quickly developed into meetings that were kept secret from brothers and fathers. With gentle yet authoritative voices, the Watchers made promises, offered charms, and used coded language that humanity had never heard before. They carried with them tidbits of information about the heavens, just enough to astonish and tempt, but not the whole truth. And ties were forged between them, but they were based on defiance. These were unions created out of desire and secrecy, not because they were blessed. Fragile and oblivious to the enormity of what was happening, the daughters of men were forced to live with creatures that were not like them. They carried the burden of fear and attraction, of love and wonder. Some felt selected, privileged, but none really understood the extent of the sin. They were unaware of the price. These angels appeared to them as mysterious, powerful men who provided something that no one else could. They were the Watchers' solution to a hunger that had engulfed the villages started to evolve. Stories of strangers who arrived in the middle of the night and of daughters who had disappeared from their homes only to return with secrets in their eyes were whispered among the crowd. A few dads became uncomfortable, but what could they say? Who could fight these creatures? No mortal man could challenge the authority and power with which the Watchers had descended. The odd ties continued to grow, forbidden but strengthening, hidden but unbroken. The change appeared to be felt by the earth itself. The weight of this mixing strained the harmony that had once pervaded creation. Union existed where separation ought to have occurred. Heaven reached into the earth and woven itself into flesh where it should have stayed separate. Now intrusion tainted what had been watched in purity. Once innocent in their place, the daughters of men were enticed into a union that heaven had not intended for them. Semjaza saw what they had done and realized that they could not reverse the action they had taken. They had all been bound by his oath, and now their deeds had distanced them from the light they had once served. But he didn't go back. Not one of them did. They defended themselves by convincing themselves that love could forgive disobedience and that desire could dissolve the limits placed upon them. In actuality, though, their desire had brought them to chains that were heavier than any they had feared on that mountain. Their relationships differed from those of men and women who develop a relationship over time and through love. These were hastily created, fueled by hunger and forced into existence by forces that ought to have had a much smaller impact on humanity. And something new, something neither earth nor heaven had experienced, would emerge from these unions. Once valued solely for their delicate beauty, the daughters now carried a seed that was not entirely human inside of them, a burden they were still unable to comprehend. The Watchers had gone too far in both their deeds and their oath. They had changed the path of humanity with bonds that should never have been there because of their desire for men's daughters, which had caused them to claim things that did not belong to them. The balance of creation had changed, even though the stars were still glittering and the night was still quiet. Now, the disobedience of heaven was concealed in the lives of daughters who possessed the mark of angels' desire in human homes. There was more to the tale that started on Mount Hermon. It had reshaped human life in ways no one had yet anticipated, spilling down into its very core. The Watchers, now completely entangled, could no longer be referred to as guardians. The secret was in the daughters of men. They were something else, chosen, bound by desire, and embarking on a journey that would rock the world to its foundation. There was a time when the earth had a more peaceful rhythm, when men used simple tools for hunting, when disagreements were resolved by distance or words, and when the strength of a hand served as a measure of defense. However, something changed after the Watchers went down, and Azazel was at the center of this change. Azazel's fascination took a different route than that of some of his friends, whose passion for men's daughters consumed their hearts. He considered power in addition to beauty. He witnessed humanity's unadulterated potential and how it could be molded, honed, and transformed into something far more dangerous than it had ever been. Azazel's thoughts shifted restlessly. He started telling the sons of men things they had never been allowed to know. He demonstrated to them how to extract metals that were concealed in the darkness from the earth's dust and the mountain veins. He taught them how to shape with a hammer and fire, as well as how to refine and smell. Simple tools made of wood or stone developed into sharp edges that gleamed in the sunlight, resembling shining blades. The forbidden teaching of an angel who was supposed to protect, not corrupt, gave rise to the first weapons of war, not human invention. Men were initially in awe of these gifts. Their eyes widened at the strength of such creations as they saw the glitter of iron and bronze. Armor gleamed like a beast's scales, spears pierced deeper, and knives cut cleaner than flint. Men eagerly embraced these skills, which made possible what had previously seemed impossible. They saw it as progress, as divine favor. A seed of destruction, however, was hidden beneath the surface of this knowledge and would soon germinate in the soil of human pride. The first bloodshed occurred in disputes between brothers, neighbors, and clans rather than in major battles. A fight that might have ended in backstabbing or bruises turned deadly. Men experienced the power of taking a life in their hands, and a single blow with a sharpened blade permanently silenced voices. Shock quickly gave way to fear, which in turn hardened into acceptance. One man needed a weapon to protect himself if another did. As a result, mistrust spread like a shadow across the planet as weapons proliferated. Azazel didn't limit himself to just weapons. He taught men how to forge war ornaments, armor, and shields. Envy and rivalry were sparked when he showed them how to polish metals until they were dazzling. He demonstrated for them how to wear jewelry that exuded pride and power, and as well as how to inlay gold and silver. Vanity, rivalry, and the desire to surpass others engulfed what had once been simple lives dressed in plainness. Mankind deviated more and more from the simplicity it had known with every lesson. Like storms on the horizon, the first organized conflicts arose. Villages that had previously coexisted started to distrust one another. Violence was sparked by a disagreement over land, herds, or honor. Spears clashed, the ground was smeared with blood, and where the sounds of song and harvest had once filled the air, the cries of the wounded resounded. With every generation that went by, the cycle of bloodshed accelerated as fathers fell and sons rose to exact revenge. Men's daughters, who had been captivated by the Watchers, now witnessed a different aspect of their power. In the firelight, their husbands' weapons shone brightly, but they also created lengthy shadows. Mourning became a common sound as fear infiltrated homes. Women cried for fathers killed by blades that shouldn't have been there, for sons buried too soon, and for husbands who never came back. Families' tranquility broke under the strain of fresh violence. With an odd sense of fulfillment, Azazel strolled among men. He sought dominion, while other watchers sought out forbidden unions. He saw humanity ascending towards something darker through his gift of death mastery, not love. His teachings fostered pride, and pride in turn fostered conflict, and strife turned into war. The initial conflicts were minor, involving warring tribes shedding blood across slender fields, but they eventually expanded. The methods became more brutal, the armor heavier, and the weapons sharper with each generation. Men now used Azazel's whispered tactics, such as formations, sieges, and ambushes, in addition to their hands. The ground drank deeply of blood, and mortals began to know the things that they should never have. The dead wailed into the sky, the violence weighed heavily on the earth, and the corruption that had spread was evident in the soil itself. Once sacred blood was spilled as if it were inconsequential. Homes were reduced to ashes, fields were left fallow, and children were raised in a society where death was no longer an unfamiliar sight. Humanity's innocence waned and was replaced by hardness and fear. But because of the power he had bestowed upon them, men continued to regard Azazel with awe. They saw him as a source of wisdom, a teacher of strength, and a benefactor. They took pride in ornaments and charms and adorned themselves with jewelry made from the metals he had exposed. Their attention was diverted from the blood on their hands by the glimmer of gold. Swords dripping with life were carried by the same hands that wore silver bracelets. Because Azazel's influence grew more extensive than theirs, the Watchers themselves became restless. He changed the way men lived while they engaged in illegal unions. His legacy was found in corrupted societies as well as corrupted families. He sowed the seeds of kingdoms founded on conquest and of men who gained power via war, not intelligence. The once patient heavens started to tremble with anxiety when the Most High, who had designated the Watchers to protect and lead, looked down on the planet. He saw that violence was increasing. The sky was filled with the cries of innocent people who wanted justice. However, the Watchers persisted unchecked for the time being, their corruption permeating every aspect of human existence and their defiance growing with each act. At its heart stood Azazel, the great corrupter who had unveiled what had been concealed for a purpose. His hands were discolored by the knowledge he had poured into people's hearts rather than by actual blood. They had welcomed the instruments of death with open arms after he had given them to them. Therefore, it was the forbidden teaching of a Watcher whose legacy would reverberate through the ages that wrote the first chapters of war on Earth rather than human invention. Creation's silence had been broken. The Earth was familiar with conflict where it had previously known peace. Men now carried iron and bronze weapons where they had previously lived with crude implements. Previously, disagreements ended with words, but now they ended with graves. Above all, Azazel watched as the first massive wave of blood swept across the planet, content with the labor he had done. It's been said that knowledge is like fire. It can guide and warm, but it can also be consumed. None of the Watchers more personified this danger than their leader, Semjaza, whose voice had the capacity to influence his fellows' opinions when they took an oath on Mount Hermon. He was the one who tore open the curtain between the sacred and the forbidden, unlocking what ought to have remained sealed. Since these were lessons entrusted to the heavens and bound to worlds unexplored by humanity, the mysteries he carried were never intended for mortal ears. Semjaza, however, started to release them as his feet made contact with the ground, one by one, like sparks leaking from a secret fire into the parched grass of the world below. By transforming incantations into words with an unearthly weight, he taught both men and women the art of charms and enchantments. Once innocent in its simplicity, the spoken voice has evolved into a weapon of deceit and manipulation. People discovered how to use whispers to change reality and create unseen power bonds that changed other people's lives. Invocations were now tinged with envy, desire, and a desire for power, whereas before they rose into the sky like pure incense. Under Semjaza's tutelage, humanity learned to etch symbols on bones and stones, tying their will to things and creating power vessels that glowed dangerously. These lessons also captivated the women. He taught them how to enhance allure with paints and powders, and he gave them the keys to adornment and enchantment through beauty. Until men's hearts could no longer distinguish reality from illusion, what had been natural was magnified. Families disintegrated as desires grew stronger, and the straightforward ties of life were replaced by complex webs of jealousy and passion. Semjaza seemed to have rewoven the strands of human nature into a thin fabric of deceit and vanity. His reach, however, extended even farther. He taught how to make amulets, charms that are bound to either protect or destroy, to attract good fortune or repel bad luck. Unaware that each token further seeded them to the darkness from which it originated, people buried them beneath their fields, tied them to their doors, and wore them around their necks. The invocation of these invisible forces may cause a farmer's harvest to flourish rather than through honest labor. A soldier may be able to avoid death by using the shadowed power at his wrist rather than by skill or bravery. However, since nothing the Watchers offered was free, every blessing came with a secret curse. When envy began to grow among those who practiced these new arts, the first real glimpse of destruction appeared. His neighbor used whispered incantations to bring down a successful man. One woman will use charms to spread love if another finds it. Friendship trust eroded like sand washed away by waves. Chants, which would have been prayers but now curled like smoke toward darker realms, rose against the stars as the village fires burned late into the night. The weight of these practices is said to have caused the earth to tremble. Sensing the change in the air, the animals became restless in their enclosures. Where curses lingered, crops withered. As invisible hands pulled at the fabric of their lives, children became ill. With every new spell and charm, the once harmonious balance of creation became increasingly dislocated. The signs were obvious to anyone with a clear view. The once bright heavens appeared to be dimming. Once peaceful dreams have now turned into shadowy nightmares. People persisted, though, as if they were thirsty for water, but were only consuming salt that would never quench their thirst. As they gained more knowledge, their desire grew stronger, and Semjaza, standing among them, stoked that desire like a firefighter tending to a fire. According to some, he disclosed rituals for evoking visions and looking into worlds that were not intended for mortal sight. Men and women congregated in secret locations, making circles on the ground while whispering Semjaza's words until the veil shook. Storm-like flashes of half-seen creatures and shapes too horrible for the human mind to contain were the visions. Some ran away in fear, while others kept coming back, addicted to the insanity of seeing things that shouldn't be seen. Their hearts twisted, their sanity snapped, but they persisted, unable to veer off the course that had been set for them. The sky that these children grew up under was darker than what their parents had experienced. They observed their fathers bartering with tokens of strange power, heard their mothers whispering incantations, and saw charms hanging at doorways. Early on, they discovered that survival depended more on the shrewd application of hidden arts than on kindness or hard work. Because Semjaza's hand had changed their world, a generation raised in this shadow would never recall the innocence that existed before. Despite all of his teachings, there was still a void, a hollow echo that could not be filled by magic. The more they practiced, the more fragile they became. But initially, the people were too preoccupied with their newfound control to notice it. Once uplifted by sincere prayer and the cycles of the seasons, their spirits now shook under the weight of forces beyond their control. They were gradually hollowed out by what they believed to be their strength, and even among those who claimed the greatest mastery, fear persisted in everyone's heart. At the center of it all was Semjaza, whose presence covered the landscape like a shadow. Through their descent, he had promised his companions glory, and now he had given it to them, not in the light they had known, but in a fake glow, a radiance warped by deceit and desire. Humanity, oblivious to the chains being forged, stepped further into the trap as the ground felt heavy beneath it and the air seemed heavy with it. The world would never be the same after the forbidden arts were made public, and as night fell, the stars were concealed by the veil of darkness, and the wind carried whispers of enchantments that drew hearts farther away from their former innocence and toward shadows that held only destruction but promised wonders. Because the mystery of the stars was his area of expertise, Barakiel was one of the Watchers whose knowledge was intended to stay hidden in the heavens. Awe, wonder, and worship were always evoked by the lights that filled the night sky, which had always been a canvas spanning eternity. Before his descent, the constellations were revered but ununderstood by men and women who saw them as far-off fires that the Creator had placed for rhythm and beauty. Only the sun's rise and the wind's cooling signaled the arrival and departure of the seasons. However, as Barakiel moved among people, he started to rev. mysteries concealed within those glistening designs, and the world started to shift as a result. He traced lines between the stars while standing beneath the sky, creating shapes that no human eye would have considered combining. He explained to them that these constellations had meaning and that each figure represented a sign with authority over life and the planet. He claimed that the stars whispered tales of birth and death, love and war and destiny. He demonstrated with a wave of his hand how the heavens were a book, written in light rather than ink, and that anyone who dared could read it. The populace listened in awe as he clarified that the planet's motion was not merely a meandering, but rather an influence that reached into people's hearts. Villages that had prayed to the Creator soon found themselves staring tensely into the night sky, anticipating what the stars would say about their destiny. Farmers inquired as to which constellation would bestow blessings on their crops. Mothers looked for clues about their children's futures. Before battle, warriors paused and looked up for signs. Every choice started to rely on the tilt of the heavens, as if the patterns above had taken the place of human volition. What was once led by prayer and wisdom now sagged under the weight of calculations and constellations. Barakiel demonstrated for them how to draw the skies on parchment and clay. He whispered creatures and symbols from his ancient knowledge into circles that were divided into 12 sections. As if men were destined from the moment they breathed, he taught them the art of mapping births against the stars. The populace was astounded because they believed the stars themselves were speaking when his prophecies came true. The alignment of Mars and the Moon may have told a shepherd that he was destined for greatness, while Saturn's shadow over her sign may have warned a young woman of sorrow. Life gradually shaped itself around the invisible chords Barakiel taught them to trace, rather than around freedom or truth. The snare tightened the more they listened. Leaders put off wars until the stars were in their favor, and families put off marriages until the stars were in agreement. They cursed the heavens in times of disaster and praised the constellations in times of good fortune. Once filled with awe, their eyes now gazed in terror, eager to find out what fate lay ahead. Once serving as a reminder of the Creator's majesty, the stars have changed into a silent tribunal that decides every human decision. And hope was subtly tainted by this knowledge. Desperation loomed like a shadow over those who were told their fate was not favorable. A man born under what Barakiel deemed an unlucky sign might never try because he thinks failure is inevitable. Even in the face of joy, a woman forewarned of loss may cling to sadness. The Watcher's teachings became self-fulfilling, influencing the course of lives that might have developed in different ways. What ought to have been a wide avenue of opportunity became a predestined route penned by Barakiel's whispers rather than by the Creator of heaven. Of course, nothing had changed with the stars themselves. They continued to burn steadily and silently as always. However, under Barakiel's direction, people gave them voices they had never had. They confused the beauty of creation with the ability to control it, giving up their freedom to lights that were never intended to command. And the Watcher's influence became more and more pronounced in this confusion. Men sold star charts in the marketplaces, promising fortune, wealth, and love. Women wore amulets fashioned after constellations because they thought they drew blessings close by or warded off evil. The movement of the heavens gave rise to entire rituals, such as marriages synchronized with the rising of specific stars, journeys initiated only when planets aligned, and sacrifices made during moon-shadowing eclipses. The sky turned into a prison of never-ending calculations as what started out as wonder turned into obsession. Before they knew their names, children grew up hearing about their signs. They were told things like, "You are born of the lion's star," or "The twins rule your fate." These statements molded their hearts and influenced their futures before they had the ability to make their own decisions. According to their signs, villages were split up into groups. Some were thought to be born superior, while others were cursed. The Watcher's hand sowed seeds of division that grew into pride and rivalries, each of them ensnared in ways they could neither fully comprehend nor escape. Once reassuring, the night's beauty now evoked anxiety. Fearful of missing a sign, people counted stars rather than sleep. Dreams became laden with omens and symbols, with every flicker or shadow being interpreted as a message. Quietly, peace vanished, to be replaced by an insatiable desire to know what was unknown. The eternal, uncaring stars silently observed humanity shackling itself to meanings that had never been intended for them. Meanwhile, Barakiel watched, his voice steady and convincing, combining fear and wonder into one unbreakable chord. He didn't have to yell or give orders. As if their lives depended on it, the people themselves sought him out, pleaded with him to read their fates, and hung on every word. Unaware of the weight of chains encircling them, they bowed their hearts voluntarily when he simply pointed to the sky. What started out as knowledge quickly turned into worship. Under the open sky, altars rose, and people offered sacrifices to the constellations themselves rather than to the creator of the stars. Prayers were whispered to the Pleiades, sacrifices were offered to the wandering planets, and songs were sung to Orion. Until the heavens elves turned into idols, separating humanity from the one who had placed those lights. The distinction between creation and creator became hazy. Barakiel left behind not just his understanding of the stars, but also his willingness to give up his independence to them. He had transformed what was lovely into a trap, and what was pure into shadows. Once providing solace to shepherds observing their flocks, the constellations now governed both kings and commoners. His teachings caused the heavens to evoke fear, desire, and an unending quest for signs that never stopped binding instead of awe. Humanity thus continued to fall deeper into the delusion of fate beneath the limitless canopy of stars, thinking that their paths were marked in constellations and failing to recognize that what they were following was actually the whisper of a watcher who had turned light into chains rather than the voice of heaven. Since Kokabeel was supposedly the watcher entrusted with the vast order of constellations, his name carried the weight of the heavens themselves. While Barakiel hinted at stars and their effects, Kokabeel took the lesson a step further by exposing not just the patterns depicted in the night sky, but also the alleged rules and outcomes they imposed on the planet. He was the one who taught men that the sky was a mechanism with revolving wheels that determined war, love, life, and death in addition to being a map. As he moved through the mountains and valleys, he raised his hand to follow the slow motion of the stars as they revolved overhead. He demonstrated to them how, as if the sky were a giant clock and every change in light was a decree inscribed in fire, constellations marked not only seasons but also destinies. With clay tablets and sharpened sticks, men gathered at his feet to copy the heavens onto the earth and create charts that indicated when to plant, harvest, marry, and fight. Before long, the stars were feared more than kings. It started out innocently enough with basic cycle knowledge. According to Kokabeel, some constellations predicted the arrival of rain, while others forewarned of the harshness of winter. Farmers embraced this knowledge because it made their work more organized. However, the weather did not stop the watcher. According to him, every constellation had authority over the lives that were born beneath it. He said that children born under the scorpion's sting would have tempests in their hearts, while those born under Orion's belt would be powerful in combat. In search of purpose, the populace believed. They started to discuss newborns in terms of constellations, rather than their innocence, influencing lives before they had even started. Subtle but devastating was what happened next. People in villages were separated according to the stars under which they were born. While some were hated, others were honored. Rivalries developed as a result of signs found in the sky rather than actions. Because they were afraid of bad luck, men would not marry women with certain constellations. Soon, an invisible caste system spanned the land, with destinies bound not to faith or character, but to the shifting points of light above. Leaders only trusted advisors born under what Kokabeel declared to be favorable skies. Additionally, the Watcher taught how to use constellations as power tools. He told them that one could summon invisible forces by setting stones in the shape of celestial bodies. Families constructed altars in the shapes of twins, lions, and bears. As though carved animals in the sky were ravenous for blood, sacrifices were offered to those patterns rather than to the Creator. And believing that the offerings had influenced the heavens, the people praised the constellations when a harvest, a storm, or a victory occurred. Kokabeel demonstrated to them that it was possible to control as well as observe how stars moved across the horizon. In order to tie decisions to the constellations, he taught rituals. He said that a marriage sealed under one alignment would succeed while one joined under another would fail. Merchants held off on trading until the stars aligned with their roots, and kings postponed wars until certain stars were bright. They ruled, and the stars ceased to shine. Under the Watcher's voice, men's and women's freedom deteriorated and was replaced by superstition, masquerading as cosmic law. However, fascination, rather than fear, was what pulled them in. Knowing the stars meant having power that others did not. Villages fought for the best star readers, and the people who asserted Kokabeel's expertise gained power. Priests of entire classes appeared, their power based on stones, charts, and hushed interpretations. Those who expressed disagreement or skepticism were silenced on the grounds that they were opposing the heavens. For those who wielded their fictitious dominion, the constellations thus became both a trap and a throne. Before they could read words, children spent their childhood learning the constellations. They were instructed to recite their purported meanings, memorize their patterns, and draw them in the sand. A girl might be told, "The scales claim you," or a boy, "You are bound to the hunter." Even before youth blossomed into choice, such identities became heavy chains. Even an innocent child would be distrusted if they were warned of betrayal by the scorpion's sign. A girl who was told she was marked by sorrow grew up anticipating sorrow, and the shadows from the sky made her laugh less. The chains tightened with each generation. Fathers told their sons and daughters stories about the stars until Kokabeel's knowledge was as legally binding as the law before. Long, people only asked how to interpret the constellations correctly, not if they had any power. And true wisdom was lost in that never-ending search. The Watcher's teachings obscured the Creator, who had positioned those lights for guidance and beauty. His voice was lost in the never-ending cacophony of signs and symbols. Once a source of solace for shepherds sprawled out on the grass, the night sky itself has come to weigh heavily on people's hearts. Men used to view the heavens as a peaceful canvas, but now they see an unending book of commands, with each star representing a decree that must be obeyed. The fear of invisible bonds took the place of dreams of freedom. The earth was enveloped in the glow of the constellations, which turned into chains of light that extended from horizon to horizon. Kokabeel did not yell or brag as he observed this change. There was no need for force to exert his influence. It crept slowly until the world itself was bent, much like the slow turn of the heavens. His rumors turned into laws, his teachings into customs, and his whispers into traditions. And as men and women raised their gazes to the night sky, they were unaware that by doing so, they had given up control to a watcher who had ensnared the constellations in a cage. Since the Creator first hung the stars in the firmament, they have remained the same and continued to burn with the same light. However, Kokabeel changed their meaning. What started out as a reminder of wonder turned into a fate illusion. Under that delusion, people lived as if the stars themselves controlled their lives, unaware that they were actually following the shadow of a watcher who had taught them to mistake chains for fate rather than the heavens. Penamue was one of the watchers who possessed knowledge that, although appearing innocuous at first, contained a subtle yet profound power that changed the trajectory of human existence. Writing was his gift to humanity. Stories were transmitted from parent to child, from elder to youth, and continued on the brittle thread of voice until his descent. However, Penemu gave humanity a tool that could preserve thought for more than a lifetime when he disclosed the method for writing words on stone, clay, and parchment. Scratches on tablets quickly developed into a system of symbols, a living record that persisted long after the speaker's breath had dried up. As Penemu knelt in the dust and drew the first signs, men and women gathered around him. He clarified that every line and curve had a purpose and that ideas could be fixed to ensure they would always be remembered. Their fingers pressed lines into clay as they imitated him, amazed that they could come back hours later and still find their words waiting. The stories of ancestors and the knowledge of elders were no longer solely preserved by memory. The power of words had transcended the human mind's weakness and become eternal. It was a marvel at first. Farmers documented harvests, floods, and the onset and end of seasons. The flock's numbers were marked by shepherds. Before laying a foundation, builders drew up their plans. As merchants began using marks to track debts, promises, and exchanges, trade became increasingly complicated. Where there had only been ephemeral words, writing provided structure. With enduring symbols, life appeared more stable. Penemu, however, did not stop with basic documentation. He demonstrated to them how letters could bind more than just numbers. They could form laws, commands, and stories, in order to ensure that their voices were heard not only over long distances, but also across generations. Kings soon demanded scribes who could write down their decrees. Unaffected by time, a word inscribed on parchment or carved into stone became an unbreakable command. Once dependent on physical presence, authority now persisted long after the ruler's passing. Writing evolved from a tool to a weapon, a means of extending power beyond death. The wonder of writing was both frightening and inspiring to the average person. They witnessed the writing of their histories, the immortalization of their myths, and the recording of their prayers to endure beyond the short time of their lives. However, they also observed the imbalance it brought about. Penemu's teachings required hours of practice, patience, and discipline, so not everyone could become proficient. A divide between the literate and the illiterate quickly developed as those who could learn separated from those who could not. Because controlling the key to writing meant controlling memory itself, the scribes became increasingly powerful and cautious in their knowledge protection. The hidden power of words, Penemu explained to them, was that symbols could influence thought, and that the arrangement of letters could influence how men understood the truth. Once something was in writing, he whispered, it carried a weight that speech alone could not. A written word seemed timeless, demanding belief even when it contained lies, but a spoken story could be questioned, forgotten, or changed. With this realization, writing evolved into a persuasive tool as well as a record. Men discovered that if they carved falsehoods into stone, they would become monuments that would not be challenged over time. The Watcher also demonstrated the elegance of poetry and the carefully planned rhythm of language. He imparted knowledge on how to make words sing on paper, arouse passion, and move people. Previously requiring a bard's voice, songs could now be carried silently on tablets and still evoke strong feelings in the reader. This gift brought with it more complex stories than ever before, myths that were so intricately written that they could not be preserved by memory alone. Humanity's imagination was expanded because it now had a base to work from. However, this wonder was laced with danger. Writing brought secrecy. Men and women were able to conceal information from one another for the first time, using symbols that were only readable by those who were initiated. Only selected disciples were given access to the jealously guarded written secrets of power. Once dying mysteries were now preserved and passed on to future generations like buried fires. Knowledge that ought to have been temporary became permanent, growing underground like roots, invisible but unavoidable. Anger and division were also made permanent through writing. Whereas arguments might eventually fade, curses and threats can now be inscribed to endure beyond even reconciliation. Words set in clay gave feuds more weight. Years could not soften a king's bitter decree because the stone continued to scream its verdict. The written record sharpened memories that could have been healed. The way humanity viewed itself was also influenced by Penemu's teachings. Writing a name was an act of claiming one's identity and giving oneself structure and durability. As if carving letters would allow them to live on after death, men started writing their names on their belongings, homes, and monuments. Inscriptions on tombs promised remembrance. The written word provided the appearance of immortality, the idea that a person had not completely died as long as their name was still in existence. However, despite its strength, this desire kept people closer to the ground by directing their attention to inscriptions rather than heaven. Tribes and nations were swiftly swept away by the awe that writing evoked. Those who were skilled at it gained respect because their voices could travel farther than the feet of a messenger. Claiming that written petitions were more binding than verbal ones, priests started writing prayers. As long as the symbols persisted, charms and spells were thought to have power and were buried beneath thresholds, worn around the neck or carved into tablets. Writing entered the world of magic, where it was believed that the arrangement of letters could bend invisible forces. What started out as a gift of memory got mixed up with fear and superstition. Nevertheless, men were unable to ignore the shadows it cast. The written word was too irresistible. Penemu's gift was refined, shaped, and expanded upon by each generation. With each century that went by, the written record expanded, symbols multiplied, and alphabets expanded. The populace started to gauge their greatness by their words on tablets and scrolls, rather than just by their conquests or monuments. As if writing were indispensable to human existence, civilization itself started to revolve around its durability. Meanwhile, Penemu observed the growth of the seed he had sown. He was aware that writing brought with it both memory and distortion, wisdom and servitude. He was aware that once words are fixed, they have the power to either bring people to greatness or ruin. He had bestowed upon them a seemingly innocuous gift that possessed the power to alter nations, mold ideologies, and manipulate emotions. He had given them something much sharper, the unfailing power of words instead of a sword. Humanity hunched over tablets and scrolls, enthralled with the art Penemu had unveiled in the silence of the night when torches burned low and the faint scratching of styluses echoed. They were unaware of the invisible chains becoming tighter and that writing started to master them as well. Like a silver lantern, the moon hung over the earth, steady and bright, serving as a guide for dreamers, shepherds, and travelers. However, in the past, the moon was more than just a peaceful nighttime companion. It was a mystery with secrets much deeper than its light would imply. Sariel was one of the watchers who descended, and her area of expertise was the moon, time, and the changing of the seasons. The moon was only a light to indicate the night and a passing cycle to humanity, which was still very primitive. However, Sariel gave them the ability to map life according to the beat of divine order and to divide days into months and months into years. This gift seemed miraculous at first. People used the waxing and waning of the moon to determine how many nights it was. They learned how to plant when the moon's cycle promised spring and how to brace for the impending cold when winter was approaching. Farmers started to depend on it, shepherds used it to guide their flocks, and hunters used its faint light to time their hunts. However, humanity changed with each measured rhythm. Before, life depended on instinct and the sun rising, but now there was order, control, and the ability to direct time itself. Sariel gave them an explanation of the significance of the moon's phases, how eclipses marked important events, and how each movement denoted change. It was as if the heavens themselves were whispering secrets into the ears of those who listened. Once a mystery, it evolved into a precise, nearly divine system. Eager and wide-eyed, humanity clung to this newfound mastery. They started constructing customs around it, including prayers for fertility when the silver crescent reappeared in the sky, festivals during the full moon, and sacrifices during the new moon. However, the first burden of expectation accompanied this order. People turned to the moon and the lessons Serial had taught them. If crops failed, flocks dwindled, or children became ill. Did they count the nights incorrectly? Had they disregarded the phases? They started to link their fortunes to cycles in the sky as well as to the Creator. With every season, the distinction between superstition and trust became increasingly blurred, and faith and rhythm blended together. The teaching had been a gift to Serial, but it soon turned into a means of gauging human fate. They looked at the moon to forecast their life's course, as well as to determine when to plant seeds or harvest grain. The moon turned into a fate clock. Midwives whispered blessings under its glow, believing that life itself was tied to the shape of its curve. Kings consulted its signs before declaring war, and lovers waited for auspicious nights to unite. The heavens were not blind to this change in human thinking. What had been a straightforward trust in God's timing had evolved into an interest in the predictable, with patterns that could be predicted and possibly managed. When men started to divide and count time, they also started to yearn for control over it, which made the earth more restless. They attempted to dam the river of days, control its flow, and sway it to suit their own purposes rather than merely living inside it. Mortality also became quantifiable as time itself did. Death had previously only been a shadow that appeared when it pleased. Men now marked their lifespans by the number of moons they had seen, counted their years, and watched their hair turn gray. Fear followed as the realization of life's limitations became more acute and agonizing. Humanity started looking for methods to prolong life, maintain youth, and stop the moon's cycle from ebbing away. What started out as awe quickly turned into obsession. Tribes adopted Serial's teachings, which were transmitted like a holy legacy. Before they could read words, children learned to read the sky. In the dirt, elders traced lunar charts and related tales of how some moons brought good fortune and others bad luck. The moon's silent command led to the lighting of fires atop mountains to mark the change of season. Rumors spread among the populace that if the moon could show the beat of time, it might also be able to reveal the mysteries of fate. Curiosity gave way to temptation at this point. Now, those who had learned to measure months attempted to manipulate them. Chants and incantations were connected to the moon's phases. Until the moon and stars lined up, marriages were postponed. Because they thought it added a sense of surprise, armies waited for nights when the moon was obscured. What started out as direction soon turned into a mechanism to control results, and people began to focus more on the cycles Serial had revealed than on the Creator's hand. The other Watchers silently agreed as Serial's lessons complemented their own. When Barakiel's astrology and Kokabil's constellations were combined with the moon's rhythm, they gained new strength. Predictions turned into chains and patterns into predictions. Eager to learn more, humanity bound itself to these cycles until their faith was based on observable phases, charts, and symbols rather than on invisible trust. Once a canvas of wonder, the night sky has evolved into a ledger and a tool for predicting success or failure. And as the people looked up, they saw more of their own desperate desire for power and less of God's majesty. As always, the moon shone quietly and serenely, but now its light bore a burden it was never intended to carry. Under its radiance, people started to forget that time was a gift rather than a possession. And the earth itself appeared to get heavier as Serial's wisdom spread. Men started to hold each other responsible for not just actions, but also for the times chosen, the nights observed, and the moons honored as the seasons changed precisely and rituals multiplied. They had a new burden on their shoulders, one that came from calculation rather than freedom. Because men forget the one who possesses eternity when they think they can control time, the seeds of despair were subtly planted in this burden. As the Watcher's forbidden teachings spread like fire from tree to tree, the world that had once moved in simple rhythm, driven only by the rising sun and the peaceful patterns of nature, started to change. Each bit of information initially appeared to be tiny, like a spark. Barakiel with the stars, Kokabeel with constellations, Semjaza with enchantments, Sariel with the measure of the moon, Penemu with the craft of writing, and Azazel with his weapons. Each lesson was significant on its own, but when combined, they created something much more powerful that twisted the very fabric of existence. Fragile and unprepared, humanity suddenly found itself in possession of a treasure it could not handle. The combination of all knowledge that was forbidden. Once peaceful communities, they now throbbed with restlessness as the seasons changed. Men now tested armor, sharpened blades, learned to wound, and did more than just till the land for food. In addition to caring for children and weaving cloth, some women now learned secret incantations, charms to bind love, or curses to cause harm. In addition to following animal shadows in the fields, children spent their childhood tracing letters in the dirt and speaking strange words that were previously reserved for angels. What was once innocent was now layered with danger, power, and complexity. The balance between spirit and body started to fall apart. In the past, life flowed with an invisible balance as people's hands worked and their hearts prayed. Now, however, their minds were racing faster than their spirits due to this flood of information. They grew more quickly than their faith could support them. They made more ambitious plans than their hearts could support. Because humanity tried to use the gifts of heaven for control rather than reverence, they turned into burdens. Weapons gleamed in the sunlight, ready to spill human blood rather than hunt animals. In addition to preserving wisdom, writing also preserved curses and the names of spirits that should not have been called. The cycles of the moon provided order, but they also bound people to rituals, fear, and never-ending fate calculations. Stars that were once admired for their beauty turned into sinister symbols whose patterns dictated decisions and fate. Together, these threads of knowledge created a net that ensnared people and held them in a web that they had created. In addition to providing humanity with tools, the Watchers had unlocked secret power corridors. Moreover, those doors could not be shut once they were open. A man might draw a symbol into the ground, another might sharpen a sword, a third might whisper to the moon, and a fourth might look to the stars for direction. These might have been oddities on their own. Collectively, however, they altered belief, society, and life itself. Communities started to split. Some clung to the faith that had led their ancestors and trusted in the Creator's way. Others embraced the new information because they felt it gave them dominance and elevated them above the others. On the horizon, tension increased like a storm. The neighbors became suspicious of those whose charms worked, whose weapons gleamed too brightly in the sun, and whose stars foretold doom. Because no one knew which power was poison and which was safe, fear spread. The chaos appeared to be reflected in the earth itself. Under new farming rhythms based on lunar cycles, crops grew abundantly, but the harvests were not only celebrated with gratitude but also with rituals and new gods that were shaped by fear and imagination. Where laughter once filled the air, cries of violence reverberated as blood spilled on the ground seeped into the soil. Now, the skies, which had been constant and steady, were read like scrolls of fate, as if man could use magic and calculation to ascend into the heavens themselves. They lost their balance. Once together, spirit and body pulled in opposing directions. Men brandished swords when they ought to have raised their voices in prayer. Previously lulling their children to sleep, women now used firelight to trace hidden symbols. As knowledge increased, The world's innocence waned because unbridled wisdom is shadow rather than light. Once walking in simplicity, humanity now stumbled under the weight of secrets that were never meant for mortal hands. This weight was accompanied by hunger. The desire for more grew with each new piece of information that was made public. What else might the heavens reveal if the stars could predict fate? Could life itself be captured by writing if it could capture words? Could weapons bestow dominion if they were capable of killing? As the number of questions increased, so did pride, ambition, and rebellion. The fragments that had been given to humanity turned into a storm of desire that dragged them farther and farther away from the Creator's path. From the shadows of their descent, the Watchers observed the force of what they had let loose. They had altered the earth's shape in addition to touching it. Beneath the mingling of all their teachings, the purity of creation faded. It was a combination of numerous sins and transgressions, entwined and compounded until earth moaned under their weight rather than just one. The harmony of heaven's design had been broken, and corruption rather than blessings came out of the whole. Children who were born into this new world saw knowledge that was already tainted rather than innocence. They learned calculations before faith, charms before prayers, and symbols before faith. The ease of walking in accordance with God's timing alone was forgotten by the generations that followed. When they looked up at the sky, they saw patterns to take advantage of rather than splendor. They held weapons and implements in their hands, but rather than fostering life, they readied themselves for destruction. Their tongues formed words, but they muttered spells rather than blessings. The concoction of information produced a new reality that was both amazing and awful. Though hollow in spirit, humanity had become wise beyond its years. Without divine control, the fragments of the divine that the Watchers had given them turned into sharp shards that cut more deeply than they healed. The conflict between these ideas caused a rift in the relationship between heaven and earth, as well as in human life. With each whispered spell, star chart, and raised weapon, the rift grew wider as what had once bound them together now separated them. The world had entered a new era characterized by the restless hum of forbidden wisdom rather than innocence or purity. A dissonance that shook the earth itself was present in that hum, as though creation was lamenting the imbalance that was now ingrained in its very being. The weight of false worship weighed on the skies, the weight of blood on the ground below, and the weight of knowledge that men could never fully master on their souls. Their arrival thundered across the earth despite their quiet birth. There had never been anything like the Watchers' children and human women on the planet. Their very existence was a violation of the law, an improper mixing of heaven and earth. Instead of developing into typical babies, these kids grew into enormous beings whose bodies were larger than anyone could have ever imagined. Their height, bright eyes, and commanding voice initially filled villages with awe. Awe quickly gave way to fear, though, because these creatures were the Nephilim, giants whose hunger knew no bounds and whose strength defied the laws of nature. There were tales of babies who grew to be men in a matter of months, of boys whose running feet shook the ground, and of children who were able to move stones that dozens of men could not. As if even creation shook under their weight, their presence silenced the air, and their shadows lingered in the sun for a long time. They consumed rivers of fish, flocks of sheep, and fields of grain as if they were morsels, and they drank and ate in quantities that no land could readily supply. Humans initially made an effort to support them by giving them food, shelter, and even respect, treating these giants as if they were gods sent to live among them. However, it quickly became evident that nothing could satiate their hunger for either food or power. Their cruelty grew along with their bodies. They viewed people as prey rather than kin. Once welcoming villages started to dread their footsteps. In one sitting, a single Nephilim ate crops that should have fed hundreds. Overnight, herds of animals disappeared, devoured by their gluttony. They then turned their hunger on both men and women when there was no more food. Rivers ran red with the cries of those who had been hunted by the very children they had once raised, and flesh and bone became their feast. In addition to their size, the Nephilim possessed tremendous strength. With the force of storms, their arms could easily uproot trees and shatter stone walls. Their conflicts with regular men were nothing more than massacres. Arrows hardly penetrated their flesh, spears splintered against their skin, and even wounds healed abnormally quickly. They crushed entire groups of warriors with the ease of stomping out ants, and their laughter shook the ground, deep and menacing. Instead of armies clashing, kingdoms started to fall when a lone giant strode into their center. However, their power extended beyond their physical prowess. Some carried on their fathers, the Watchers, perverse knowledge. Some of them were able to read the stars and give orders to men who were afraid of what would happen. Others spoke in hushed tones, incorporating sinister spells into their brutality. Some left marks that terrified people by carving symbols into the stone. They were more than just beasts of flesh because of their combination of unbridled power and forbidden knowledge. They were tyrants who ruled over everyone who lived beneath them. Legend has it that they are 300 cubits tall, but the numbers are mind-blowing. The fact that the giants appeared to touch the skies with their heads mattered to those who lived beneath them, regardless of how accurate or inflated such measurements were. Dust rose in clouds as they walked. Valleys reverberated as if the mountains themselves were speaking when they roared, and no mortal defense could stand up to them when they raised their hands in violence. The Nephilim eventually turned against each other. They were too proud and had too big of appetites to share power. The ground trembled under their battles as rivalries erupted. The sight of giants clashing with one another sent mortals flying like leaves in the wind. In their wrath, mountainsides collapsed, rivers shifted, and trees snapped. Under their warring feet, man's creation was carelessly trampled and crushed. Either their hunger or their wars destroyed humanity, which was caught in the middle and had nowhere to go. Back then, songs and laments described nights when villages burned under their wrath and fire illuminated the horizon. Mothers grabbed their kids and ran away, but very few ever managed to get away from their footsteps. As they watched their homes being ripped apart like twigs in a storm, men who had once thought of themselves as strong sobbed. No altar or temple was high enough or revered enough to escape the destruction. When the giants fought on mountains, even those that men once believed to be unbreakable shook. Worship was also demanded by the Nephilim. Some saw them as divine due to their size and strength, and they were as hungry for respect as they were for food. The giants themselves were the object of altars, not heaven. They were presented with offerings of grain, animals, and even human life. They sacrificed entire families to satisfy their wrath, but their rage never subsided. They always wanted more. Those who rebelled were killed, and their communities were wiped out as if they had never existed. Human cries for salvation rose to the heavens, and fear became the universal language. It was claimed that their presence caused the earth to groan. Their feet trampled fields which did not grow. Blood poisoned rivers which dried. Where they hunted, animals vanished, leaving behind a desolate landscape. Once singing with life, the world now groaned with destruction. The shadow of these creatures who loomed over creation and twisted everything they touched was what caused darkness, not the lack of the sun. For generations, people's stories were etched with the memory of their appearance. Mothers would reassure their children with stories of escape and survival, while fathers would whisper warnings to their sons about the days when giants roamed. Humanity was scarred with fear as a result of their physical and psychological rule. In addition to power, a Nephilim's eyes revealed a void of mercy and an insatiable hunger. Beyond the limits of what creation was intended to contain, they were not only giants in appearance, but also in corruption. The Nephilim grew taller, stronger, and more vicious as a result. Like storms, they swept across the land, their tyranny unrivaled, their violence unrelenting. Something monstrous had been born out of the combination of Earth's weakness and heaven's rebellion. When the Watchers descended, they had gone too far, but the full force of that rebellion was exposed in the Nephilim. These giants, born of forbidden union, did not simply walk the earth. They dominated it, and humanity lived beneath their shadow, crying out for a day when the heavens themselves might intervene. Their names were uttered in whispers that were laced with despair and terror. Their shadows engulfed villages, and their footsteps trembled valleys. The Nephilim, the giants, had become unstoppable in their cruelty, hunger, and size, and their rule was one of constant terror. As their desires overtook everything around them, what started out as amazement, at their strength transformed into a nightmare. Their insatiable appetite expanded to include fields, forests, rivers, animals, and people. Their greed turned once thriving lands into arid waste, and entire regions were stripped bare. No wall was tall enough to stop their advance, and no law of men could stop them. Gates were ripped down, stones were flung aside like pebbles, and cities fell like leaves in the wind. The giants came to destroy, not to conquer. Their reign was characterized by chaos and bloodshed rather than governance or order. Women were taken, men were made into slaves, and children were either eaten or enslaved. The world below them bowed not out of allegiance, but rather out of fear that disobedience would result in destruction. There were tales of lone giants coming into towns and requesting food, gold, or even human lives as sacrifices. The entire village was crushed underfoot if the demands were not fulfilled. Crops were trampled underfoot, houses burned, and survivors were dispersed into the wilderness, where the giants' work was frequently completed by starvation and despair. Whole generations were raised without ever experiencing safety or tranquility. Families fled into caves and forests, clutching each other in silent terror at the sound of heavy footsteps at night. The giants' brutality extended beyond their destruction of property. They took pleasure in torturing, humiliating, as well as killing with their strength. Knowing that neither side could really prevail in their eyes, they made men fight for their entertainment. By destroying altars and claiming to be deserving of worship, they ridiculed prayers. To demonstrate their control over what was once considered sacred, some of them donned crowns fashioned from kings' bones, seemingly mocking both heaven and earth. Their voices resounded over the hills like thunder as they laughed at the misery of mortals. Even though the giants fought among themselves, it only made human suffering worse. The earth shook when two giants fought. The chaos caused rivers to divert, mountainsides to split, and forests to burn. Entire villages that were caught in the middle of their conflicts were destroyed, as if they had never been there. For those below, survival depended more on luck, concealment, and perseverance than strength. However, the giants' hunger drove them to search every inch of the land, so even the most cautious were eventually discovered. There are stories of mothers who, upon hearing the roaring laughter of giants in the distance, would cover their infants' mouths with trembling hands to silence them. In the dead of night, families would flee their homes with nothing more than the hope that they might make it to places the giants had not yet conquered. However, the giants were relentless due to their hunger and their long strides, which allowed them to spread swiftly over leagues. The world itself felt too small to contain their destruction, and nowhere seemed safe. The lives of the Nephilim were different from those of men. In a world full of prey, they ruled like predators. Some created sacred sites where sacrifice and worship were required. They erected monuments in their honor and made towns bow down to them. Many knelt down and offered what little they had in the hopes of purchasing another day of survival, because to resist was to invite slaughter. However, no sacrifice was sufficient because the giants' appetites were too great. The giants would eventually return and eat what was left, so offering sacrifice after sacrifice would only postpone the inevitable. Famine started to spread throughout the country. After being trampled too many times under enormous feet, the soil itself appeared tired of producing fruit. Animal herds decreased as a result of being eaten or exterminated. Once fish-filled rivers were choked with bones and blood. There was no recovery or rest for humanity. Those who attempted to defend themselves with weapons discovered that their arrows were innocuous and their spears were broken. Because the giants roared with laughter and men's cries went unanswered day and night, those who prayed wondered if heaven had turned its back. Some giants led bands of followers into never-ending campaigns because they loved fighting. In their hands, the weapons that Azazel had taught the men were instruments of unthinkable devastation. A giant's blade could end a battle with a single swing, whereas regular soldiers might engage in combat for days. Fields were covered in blood, towers fell, and fortress walls crumbled. No coalition of men could defeat them, and no army could stand up to them. As giants boasted of their strength and ridiculed mortals' weakness, even kings bowed in despair as they watched their people massacred. The despair their reign engendered, however, was arguably its most awful feature. Storms, starvation, and wild animals had always been a part of humanity, but they had never before encountered creatures that resembled gods, but behaved like demons. These giants, who should not have been children of heaven and earth but now ruled over both, were living examples of broken order. To look at them was to feel small, helpless, and alone. Generations were brought up in terror, hearing tales of running, hiding, and surviving one more day rather than tales of bravery or heroism. Their crimes were witnessed by the earth itself. Grass stopped growing where they walked. There was silence where they feasted. The battles they fought and the emptiness that followed left entire landscapes scarred. Once vibrant valleys turned into wastelands. Decomposition caused rivers to turn black, as if the heavens themselves were Reaving over what had happened, even the skies appeared to grow darker. Nevertheless, rumors started to circulate among men under this reign of terror. There were hints of justice, hope, and that heaven was not oblivious to the earth's cries. Even as the giants towered over the world, their violence filling the air, prayers continued to rise in the night, brittle but unwavering. How long could such corruption go on before the heavens themselves stepped in to provide an answer? The land was soaked with fear, the world was heavy with grief, and the air itself was thick with cries that seemed to go on forever toward the sky. Once full of hope and freedom, humanity was now burdened by oppression and cruelty. Their food, safety, dignity, and even hope had all been stolen by the earth-roaming giants. When men and women who had once joyfully tilled the soil looked out at their fields, they saw destruction because the fruits of their labor had been stolen before they could be harvested. Their voices, which once carried songs of life, now carried only laments, and their children were taken or crushed under the weight of monstrous feet. Every village, from the valleys to the mountains, heard a chorus of sorrow that was so steady and deep that it sounded as if the earth itself were quivering. Fearful but desperate, the people gathered together, whispering to each other about the days when they were still at peace. They described how their ancestors had experienced equilibrium, how they had moved in unison with the sky, and how they had gazed fearlessly at the stars. The night sky, which had once been a canvas of hope, now seemed far away, and the terror cast a shadow over it. With shaky hearts, the people started to do what was left of them. They raised their eyes to the sky and called for assistance. Fathers yelled for justice, mothers cried for their lost children, and elderly people pleaded for mercy in broken voices. Like rivers overflowing they, or banks and filling the earth with grief. These cries were unbridled, unrestrained expressions of despair rather than gentle prayers whispered in private. The wailing did not stop on some nights. As if all of humanity had united in a single voice, it reverberated from settlement to settlement, propelled by the wind. It was a haunting sound that floated over the waters and broke the stillness of the mountains. Asking why they had been left behind, some knelt on the ground and pounded their chests. Others raised their arms in the air, begging for help as their tears blended with the dust. It seemed as though the entire world was crying because the cries became so frequent. Even the trees, which the giants had robbed of their fruit, stood bare and resembled mourners, their branches reaching skyward in silent pain. A sense of helplessness hung like a heavy chain among the populace. They were aware that the giants were too powerful, too big, and too violent for them to overthrow their oppressors. Even submission did not save them because the giants' hunger was limitless, and resistance meant death. The terror they encountered was greater than their knowledge, strength, and weaponry. The one who created everything, the one their ancestors had whispered about with awe, the one who lived beyond the stars, was their only hope. As a result, their cries became louder, expressing their confusion, grief, rage, and desire for justice. In addition to pleading for help, they prayed for the heavens to notice their anguish and act powerfully. These cries started to take the form of lament songs, which were emotional and unstructured. They were like broken music that rose from the ground like incense. When a mother cried out the name of her child, those in the vicinity would join in, and soon the whole village was crying together. When a man who had lost his family raised his voice in vehement protest, demanding to know why such injustice was permitted, his neighbors would soon follow suit, eventually turning his cries into a deafening roar. Grief brought the broken and dispersed humanity together. They found that, despite their physical helplessness, their voices combined to create something powerful that transcended their own boundaries and entered the invisible realm. The invisible world awoke as these screams rose to the sky. Loyal to the Most High, the angels above heard humanity's suffering and felt their own sorrow. The messengers of heaven, whose hearts were heavy with the burden of human suffering, leaned close to listen even though humanity could not see them. The sound of the cries reached the Almighty's throne room and became like rivers flowing upward, unstoppable and indisputable. After witnessing the Watchers' decline and the corruption they propagated, the Creator now paid attention to the cries of those who were crushed beneath the corruption. The urgency of justice ignited the heavens with each cry, which was like a spark. The earth's inhabitants were unaware that their opinions had been taken into consideration. They kept crying, thinking they had been forgotten, but their prayers had sparked a tremendous response in the invisible world. They continued to scream despite their ignorance. Mothers wept and prayed in private that the heavens would remember them one day when children clung to them and asked why the world had grown so gloomy. Even though they knew giants would steal the harvest, fathers toiled in broken fields, planting seeds and praying with every handstroke. The old people who had witnessed tranquility and understood what had been lost lifted their shaking hands to the heavens and pleaded for the return of the past. As a result, humanity's cry did not diminish, but instead became louder every day. It turned into the Earth's own rhythm, a continual reminder that despite humanity's weakness and frailty, it still yearned for justice and had faith in a higher power that could end the reign of violence. Their cries, which pulsated upward into the heavens, became the world's heartbeat, demanding that the oppressors who ate the innocent be held accountable and that what had been stolen be put back together. It was a cry of desperation, but it was born on a thin thread of hope. The kind of hope that endures when everything else has been taken away. A council was summoned from among the powerful people who had remained faithful, far above the cries of men, in a world untarnished by the corruption that tarnished the earth. The gathering was witnessed by the heavens themselves, as the air became motionless as the four enormous archangels positioned themselves in front of the Most High's throne. Gabriel stood solemnly in reverence, his voice bearing the messages of eternity. In his very presence, Michael, the warrior who commanded the armies of light, carried the burden of justice. Raphael, the healer of visible and invisible wounds, exuded serenity and compassion in his eyes. And Uriel, the fire of God and the light of wisdom, stood resolute, his eyes blazing with knowledge of secrets kept from the ages. With their wings covered in wonder, they formed a circle of loyalty and waited for the word that would determine the fate of the world below. Even the firmament shook from the thunderous rise of human cries. It cut through the veil separating heaven and earth and was not just sound. It was the unadulterated essence of sorrow, injustice, and despair. Until the time was right, the Most High, who sees everything and is aware of every thought and secret, had permitted the cries to fill his throne room. The council now convened, their hearts heavy with the things they had seen from a distance. The corruption of humanity, the mingling of angelic and mortal blood, the giants that ate the earth's produce, and the knowledge that was forbidden and had turned innocence into destruction. Despite their strength, the archangels all waited silently because none dared to speak in front of the Eternal One's command. Then the Almighty's voice filled the heavens, sharper than a sword but like rushing waters. It was the voice of justice, the voice of a creator whose creation had been defiled, but whose heart still turned toward the cries of the weak. It was not just anger, though anger trembled within it. The directive was unambiguous and unchangeable. The watchers who had landed on Mount Hermon, who had made their unholy covenant, who had taught humanity things that were forbidden, were to be judged. They were to destroy their descendants, the Nephilim who cruelly trampled the earth. Despite being tarnished by sin, humanity was to be spared a total erasure because mercy still prevailed. And the holy ones who were in front of him were given the responsibility of carrying out this judgment. Michael's expression hardened since he was in charge of justice. He had witnessed men being crushed under the power of creatures that shouldn't have existed, women crying over their kidnapped children, and the Nephilim terrorizing the defenseless. He was ordered to restrain the rebel leaders, weaken their forces, and get them ready for Tria. Silently, he raised his sword, shining in the light of eternity. Behind him, the armies of heaven stirred, awaiting the moment when they would descend with unstoppable force. The messenger Gabriel was given the responsibility of delivering the decree to the people who had tainted the planet. Now, his voice that spoke the words of God to kings and prophets would bring a message of doom to the fallen. He would proclaim the punishment for those who had cloaked humanity in ruin and exchanged glory for shame. His expression was dejected because, although Gabriel's heart was inclined toward mercy, he was obligated to tell the truth without hesitation out of obedience. He was aware that his words would break the watchers like glass, because when the Most High's decree was spoken, no creature could remain unfazed. Since Raphael was tasked with healing the earth itself, his role was equally important. Mothers' cries had been carried by the rivers, the soil had consumed too much blood, and corruption had tainted the air. Pain and illness, brought about by unnatural unions and prohibited arts, caused humanity to stumble. Raphael's purpose was to remind the world that mercy still came from above, to purify, and to bring harmony back where destruction had taken root. Raphael would bind Azazel and cast him into darkness, stifling the source of much of humanity's suffering. His hands, which had the touch of healing, would also become hands of judgment upon Azazel, the corrupter of men. The carrier of the concealed light was Uriel, the divine flame. He was given the responsibility of revealing mysteries to the righteous, warning of impending doom and illuminating the paths of judgment. He saw the flood that would cleanse the earth, the waters rising as both retribution and rebirth, and his eyes were sharpened not only by the present but also by the future as it was developing. His mission was to prepare the faithful, open the eyes of those who were still listening, and make sure that God's will was understood, despite the fear of what was about to happen. Uriel's presence was one of fire and clarity. For those who needed to be awakened, his words would be harsh and piercing truth. The heavens shook with anticipation as the council heard the decree. Beyond the four, countless angels waited for their cue, prepared to descend in ranks like fiery stars. The power of heaven was greater, and the order had now been given, despite the Watchers' audacious rebellion and deep corruption. Michael gripped his sword tighter. Gabriel lowered his head, the message he would convey already formed on his lips. Raphael extended his hands, ready to bind and heal. Knowing that the days ahead would rock the earth's foundations, Uriel's eyes glowed with fire. Despite their strength, none of them enjoyed the work. Though their hearts ached for what had happened to their brethren who had chosen rebellion, their devotion to the Creator remained unwavering. Before the throne, the Watchers had once stood among them, dressed in splendor, singing praise songs. They were now disgraced, their glory transformed into shame, their beauty warped. Even though judgment was required, sorrow pervaded the atmosphere because heaven itself wept whenever one of its sons disobeyed. Nevertheless, justice would not be denied because God's holiness demanded that corruption be eradicated and human cries demanded an answer. As one, the council raised their eyes to the throne, their faces shielded by their wings, and they acquiesced. The moment was set in stone. No force on earth or below it could stop what was about to happen. Orders had been established. The fate of the Watchers, their children, and the world they had tainted was set from that moment on, together with the weight of judgment and the hope that one day what had been lost would be restored. The 4 archangels, each bearing their sacred charge, readied themselves to descend at the designated time. One of the tasks assigned to the archangels, carrying a weight unlike any other, was to seize Azazel, bind him, and cast him into the dark. The decree had come from the throne. Men who had once been attracted to him as a teacher now whispered in fear his name, which had become a curse upon the planet. He was the one who taught mortals how to make weapons, how to forge blades and shields, and how to sharpen iron for both survival and slaughter. He was the one who had applied makeup to women, transforming their innocence into conceit and igniting uncontrollable desires. Because the knowledge he imparted was poisoned and intended to turn what was good into something harmful, his influence spread like a plague. Thus, the Most High's voice had proclaimed that Azazel needed to be silenced more than anyone else. The angel of healing, Raphael, was selected for this somber assignment. Even though Michael the warrior's sword could have sliced through the mountains, it wasn't him. Although his voice might have crushed Azazel's pride, Gabriel was not the herald. The one who would descend to bind the corrupter was Raphael, the one who repaired what had been damaged. It would take more than destruction to heal the deep wound Azazel had made in the world. The healer was tasked with carrying chains that were made by Devi, authority, and that could not be broken by rebellion. As soon as the command was given, Raphael silently carried the justice of heaven down, a fiery figure of light against the darkness of earth's corruption. Azazel's home was not tucked away in a lofty location. By now, surrounded by the results of his rebellion, the once luminous Watcher had turned into a figure of ruin, lurking among desolate areas. Sharpened spears, blood-stained blades, and armor that gleamed in the firelight were among the weapons he had inspired that were strewn all over the place. The cries of battle continued to reverberate around him because of his knowledge, which had prompted men to engage in combat and spill blood like water. With gratification, he had observed the rise of one brother against another, the conflict between tribes, and the saturation of the earth with death. Even as the people's cries of despair rose toward heaven, he reveled in his legacy. The earth seemed to hold its breath when Raphael appeared. Even though he had fallen, Azazel was still powerful, and his figure exuded a corrupted dark majesty. His face was a mix of fear and defiance as he raised his eyes to the angel of healing. He was aware that the decree had been made. He had heard humanity's own cries, and despite his mockery, he was powerless to stop their weight. Still, he was filled with pride. He had once sung songs in front of the throne, stood among the holy ones, and reveled in the everlasting light. He could hardly bear the humiliation of being bound by someone he had once referred to as a brother. Raphael's presence, however, was unstoppable. No amount of opposition could override his calm judgment. Raphael spoke with the Most High's authority rather than rage. The weight of eternity was in his words, which were not his own. "You no longer have a place among the Watchers, Azazel, corrupter of men. Those created in God's image have been misled by you. You had the cloaked innocence in shame and transformed creation into violence. The cries of those who suffer as a result of you have reached the throne, and the earth moans beneath your teaching. Your judgment is sealed, and you are bound by the Eternal One's command." The words sounded like thunder, and the earth trembled beneath them. Azazel's voice was bitter as he roared in defiance. He cursed the heavens for their decree, humanity for their frailty, and even his fellow watchers for stumbling in their uprising. His formerly bright wings, now darkened like storm clouds, beat the air as if he were trying to get away. Raphael's divine chains glowed with a power that was greater than any forged metal, but he spread his arms as though to call forth the earth's weapons to defend him. They were created by God himself, not by mortal hands, and they were made to hold what no mortal bond could. The light around Raphael brightened as he moved forward, pushing against the darkness that held Azazel. The Watcher battled, but in the face of heaven's command, his strength wavered. Like smoke against the wind, every effort at resistance vanished. Raphael bound him with a grip that blazed with holy fire as the chains encircled his arms, legs, and wings. As he struggled, Azazel writhed, the sound of chains clashing filling the air, but there was no way out. Every time he tried to rebel, the bonds were only made tighter, ensuring his doom. His voice erupted into a howl that reverberated throughout the mountains, a cry of desperation and fury that made men who heard it from a distance feel cold. Like a wound, the earth itself appeared to yawn. With steady steps and a composed expression of obedience, Raphael pulled the restrained Watcher in the direction of the abyss. The pit was a prison made for rebellion, not just a place of pure darkness. No whisper of power could rise from its incomprehensible depths to affect the world above, and its silence was oppressive. Raphael remained unflinching as Azazel flailed, his words shifting from profanities to cries of desperation. False repentance and bargaining did not soften God's justice. The decree must be carried out. Raphael gave Azazel one last order and threw him into the pit. The weight of the chains pulled him downward and into the abyss where no light could penetrate. As the chasm closed and the rebel was sucked into an eternity of imprisonment, the earth moaned. A profound and eerie silence ensued, as if the land itself exhaled in relief. Human cries finally found a moment of respite as the shadow that had clung to the mountains lifted for the first time in a long time. His influence was severed from the world above, and the man who taught bloodshed and corrupted men was silenced. However, Azazel's actions continued to reverberate even while he was imprisoned. Men still held the weapons he had inspired. Both men and women were still plagued by the vanity he had sowed. Since corruption had already taken hold and the effects of his teachings would last for generations, his legacy would not be erased by his imprisonment. However, his direct hand and voice had been taken away, and the justice of heaven had begun the process of re-establishing equilibrium. Standing over the sealed earth, Raphael raised his eyes to heaven and offered the quiet of a task done. The memory of chains and the assurance that no corruption could last forever were left behind when he left, his light ascending into the heavens. Semjaz. A had once been one of the most revered watchers, radiant in appearance, and given the responsibility of watching over humanity. His companions had admired his presence, his voice had been powerful, and his leadership had led the 200 angels who looked to him faithfully. However, his path was sealed when he gazed at the earth, the beauty of men's daughters, and he took that fateful oath on Mount Hermon. He was now the mastermind behind rebellion rather than the defender of purity. And now his name was cursed throughout the heavens, whereas it had once been uttered with awe, because innumerable people were pulled down with him when he fell. Semjaz's guilt was heavier than everyone else's. He had taken the lead, and the others had followed. He had been the first to advocate for the oath, to discuss desire, and to incite rebellion against the law of nature. He had pressed them despite their hesitancy, binding them with his words to prevent any of them from backing away. They had trusted that his plan would make them happy, and they had believed him when he spoke with authority. It brought them chains instead. Because he was the root from which their suffering had grown, Semjaza's name was constantly on their lips as humanity's cries rose to heaven, accusing the Watchers of their crimes. Semjaza's pride prevented him from acknowledging that his heart shook when the judgment was announced. He recalled the splendor of light, the songs of heaven, and the majesty of being in the Eternal One's presence. He was troubled by those memories because he was aware that he had exchanged them for shadows. The air around him felt heavy, pressing down as though the world itself mourned his decisions, whereas before he had been able to move freely between heaven and earth. His followers stared at him motionless, their faces contorted in terror, seeking direction, but he had nothing more to offer. Now the oath that united them was acting as a chain that was dragging them all down the path to ruin. Contrary to popular belief, Semjaza's downfall was gradual. It was a slow unraveling, a descent of inevitable doom. The Watchers fled in fear as the Most High's angels swooped down in radiance, their bodies blazing with power. No one was able to escape. Some hid in the forests, others clung to the shadows of the mountains, and still others fled into caves. Semjaza himself watched from a lofty vantage point as the heavenly armies approached. His once splendorous wings now shook as if they were burdened with dust. He made an effort to find courage and to remind himself of his former strength, but his confidence was destroyed by the Holy One's brightness. He lost all sense of strength when he saw Michael, Uriel, and the hosts of light. He tried to rally his supporters by calling out to them, but their eyes showed how hopeless they were. They were aware that it was impossible to break free from the bonds of heaven. Some called out to him, pleading with him to step in, but his voice trailed off. Once bold in his speech, he now found no words. He couldn't deny what he had done, so the guilt weighed down on him like a mountain. He had destroyed the earth, his brothers, and himself. Even though his pride continued to whisper that he had acted bravely, his heart knew that he had fallen because of weakness rather than strength, giving in to desires that consumed him. The judgment arrived with a vengeance. With a sword of fire, Michael, the great warrior, swung down upon the Watchers, terrorizing their ranks. Raphael cast Azazel into the dark and chained him. Their doom was pronounced by Uriel in a voice that shook the sky. Furthermore, Semjaza, who had led them all, received a harsher penalty than they did. With their hands like unbreakable iron, the angels grabbed him and he was unable to fight back. His once radiant form was dragged into humiliation, his wings and arms shot. Scold. As if creation itself disapproved of him, the ground beneath him shattered open and the air was heavy with the smell of burning earth. The pit that had been prepared for him was terrible and deep. It was a prison of darkness from which no light could come. Semjaza's suffering was distinct from Azazel's, who was cast into a pitch-black, hopeless world. In a place where memory itself turned into a chain, his spirit was restrained. He could feel the weight of every oath he had taken, see the faces of people he had misled, and hear their cries. His followers, the other Watchers, were dispersed into their own judgments, waiting for the last day of reckoning. Some were buried beneath mountains, while others were bound in caverns. The knowledge that it all started with Semjaza, however, was the greatest burden that remained. As he was thrown to the ground, his spirit screamed, but his voice went unheard. He was not heard by the heavens because his disobedience had denied him access to their benevolence. The earth moaned beneath the corruption he had sown, so it did not console him. Even as they were taken, his followers' faces were filled with despair and tears, but they still looked at him accusingly. They were led into chains by him after he had led them into rebellion. What started out as desire-based companionship turned into judgment-based companionship. They were bound together not in victory, but in ruin, as the oath taken on Mount Hermon was fully fulfilled. Semjaza's fall turned into a warning that was inscribed on the earth and in the heavens. As a sign of pride reduced to dust, the angels who had sung next to him now called his name. His downfall was seen by the men and women who had been burdened by the Watcher's sins as evidence that justice had not forgotten them. Stories about his fate and how even the powerful could be broken when they betrayed the Eternal One would be whispered by the generations that followed. Despite being dispersed, his followers bore his shame with them, and their chains served as a reminder of the price of disobedience. Even though Semjaza's prison was closed and his body was concealed from human view, his memory persisted like a scar after creation. Not only did he fall, but everyone who trusted him fell with him, as did those who put their desires ahead of their responsibilities and a once light-clothed company. And the silence of his prison reverberated with the weight of eternity as he lay bound in spirit, his heart divided between regret and anger. Once honored, the Watcher's leader was now shackled in the dark, waiting for the day when everything that was hidden would be exposed. Once, they had lived in the heavens, where they were surrounded by divine light and where obedience and harmony governed all their actions. The burden of judgment, however, now rested on those who had chosen rebellion, the Watchers who had come down to earth and become involved in human affairs. Their sins had not gone unpunished. They could not take back the oaths they took together, the pact they made on Mount Hermon, or their descent to mix with mortals. The consequences of their actions reverberated into eternity, and they had stepped over the line between what was allowed and what was not. There was no appeal or opportunity to avoid the fate that awaited them once the decree was spoken. Heaven itself proved that justice could not be postponed indefinitely during the Watcher's judgment. As beings of awe, the Watchers had once roamed among people, imparting knowledge that men were not yet ready to handle. They had revealed the movements of celestial bodies, the secrets of herbs, the art of enchantments, and the secrets of the stars. In its eagerness, humanity accepted what was passed down, but what at first glance appeared to be a blessing soon turned out to be a curse. Conflict, imbalance, and corruption resulted from the knowledge. The hosts of the Most High readied themselves to act as the cries suffering rose from the earth and carried the weight of grief to the heavens. Every Watcher who had taken the oath and given up their first estate was covered by the judgment that started with Azazel and Semjaza. The angels who stayed faithful took the Watchers and bound them in chains that were not made by human hands. The weight of their disobedience dimmed their once luminous forms, which were ablaze with celestial light. Their freedom was taken away, their voices were muffled, and their power was curtailed. They were flung into deep caverns beneath the surface of creation, where silence was their companion and darkness was their prison. It was confinement rather than annihilation. Instead of being extinguished, they were to wait for the day when their actions would be thoroughly evaluated in light of the eternal standard. Theirs was an immediate and incomplete sentence, chains now, full judgment later. Once the observers had marveled at the harmony of the stars and the cadence of time as they took in the beauty of creation. However, the very things they had once admired now worked against them in their rebellion. Even the mortals they aimed to govern cursed their names. The earth no longer accepted them, and the heavens were shut. Their union with women had resulted in the destruction of the giants, whose bodies had been swept away, but whose spirits, tethered to the earth as restless shades, roamed in agony. A worse fate befell the Watchers themselves. Their role as messengers of light was erased, and they lost their ability to move among the heavens. They served as illustrations and proof of what occurs when superior beings choose corruption over obedience. They did not cry like men did. They reverberated in invisible worlds, grief mixed with anger, regret mixed with rebellion. Some of them cried, asking for forgiveness, hoping that their prayers would be answered as they had in the past. Others, unwilling to accept the judgment imposed upon them, gnashed their teeth in rage and cursed their chains. However, the decree was final, and they never received the intercession they so desperately sought. They had once asked Enoch, the scribe selected by heaven, to deliver their petition to the throne, but the response had been set in stone. They would not receive a pardon. Accountability was required for what they had let loose on the planet, and no amount of pleading could undo the damage caused by creation. It was said that the place where they were imprisoned was dark, a pit devoid of light, and so deep that even thinking about the heavens was agonizing. For mortals, time is measured in cycles of days and nights. But for the Watchers who are imprisoned, time seems to go on forever, only broken by the burden of waiting. They were aware that their penalty was a holding until the final judgment rather than just a brief period of incarceration. Their fate was to face an eternal reckoning when all accounts were settled, not to be brought back to glory. Knowing this made their imprisonment even more terrifying than the gloom all around them. Humanity progressed while they lingered. After being purified from the giants' rule, the earth gradually recovered, but scars persisted. The Watchers were remembered by men as warning figures whose arrogance brought about their demise rather than as magnificent beings of light. Writings that carried the memory of their fall were preserved. Stories of their descent and imprisonment were recited as warnings, whispered in fear and passed down from generation to generation. Their names were taint, ed with shame rather than honor, and what had once appeared to be gods among men became symbols of judgment. There was no longer any unity, even among the Watchers. Once uniting them in rebellion, their oath now only served to bind them in mutual shame. Others cursed Azazel for bringing corruption that brought down the full wrath of heaven, while others hated Semjaza for misguiding them. However, they all met the same end. Their once celebrated unity degenerated into blame for one another, and their friendship turned into alienation. Despite being housed in the same prison, each person was responsible for his own decisions. Their fate was witnessed by the heavens themselves. Unfazed by the Watchers' rebellion, the sun rose and set in its designated path, the moon continued her cycles, and the stars moved in their courses. Even as they sat in disobedience, the universe reminded them every day that creation obeyed its creator. All the lights in the sky and all the rhythms of time spoke against them. Although they had attempted to influence men's destinies, they were unable to change their own fate. It is claimed that the Watchers were able to recall their former selves despite being shackled. When power is taken away, knowledge does not disappear. They recalled the forbidden arts they had taught men, the mysteries of nature and the secrets of the heavens. However, that knowledge has now turned into their suffering. Without freedom, what good was wisdom? When they could no longer see the heavens, what good was it to understand the stars? Their own memories served as reminders of what they had lost forever, like prisons inside prisons. The Watchers continued to wait for the day when their judgment would be finalized, imprisoned in the dark. Both mortals and angels learned from their fate that no position or power is so superior that it can absolve someone of responsibility. The fact that they were imprisoned was a testament to the fact that rebellion, no matter how brilliant at first, always fades into darkness. The chains that held them together were more than just iron or flame. They were the outward manifestation of eternal justice. The weight of corruption caused the once vibrant and pure earth to start changing. What started out as a garden of life turned into a violent battleground. Man, beast, and creation itself were no longer in harmony. Every day brought new cries of suffering that rolled across rivers, echoed in valleys, and spread through man-made cities. A suffocating heaviness of despair replaced the peace that had once characterized the earth, and blood stained the soil. Because the very people entrusted with the care of creation were defiling its beauty, the skies appeared to be looking down with sorrow. The children of men, who had once been innocent in their simplicity, now turned the knowledge that the Watchers' descent had brought about into instruments of destruction, igniting ambition, pride, and greed. Towering over the populace, the giants roamed free, demanding respect and submission. They were insatiably hungry, and they turned against humanity itself when the earth could no longer support them. Families lived in constant fear, hiding from creatures whose voices shook the earth and whose strength could split mountains. The giants did not respect life. They killed men like animals and ate them mercilessly. The hunger of these strange creatures, not starvation or plague, drained villages. The blood of those unable to defend themselves was soaked into the ground. Devastation, yes, Ao followed the steps of these powerful ones, leaving only wastelands and silence where once fields produced food and livestock multiplied in abundance. However, physical violence was not the only way that the earth was corrupted. Men began using magic, sorcery, and the arts of war after being influenced by the Watcher's teachings. The knowledge of metals was transformed into weapons for slaughter, and the abilities to heal were turned into poisons. Instruments of death were created from what had been given as wisdom to cultivate life. In a world of scarcity and fear, men no longer viewed one another as brothers but as rivals and enemies. Justice disappeared among them, the strong exalted themselves, and the weak were subjugated. Men themselves learned cruelty by copying the brutal methods of their oppressors, so it wasn't just the giants who ruled by force. From the family to the community, from the earth to the sky, corruption permeated every aspect of life. The cries of the defenseless turned into the earth's chorus. The elderly gazed upon a world they no longer recognized. Women lamented their dead husbands, and children wept for their parents. The rivers appeared to flow with lament, and the very air was heavy with grief. Every violent act created a lasting impression that extended well beyond the point of death. Creation itself seemed to groan under the weight of evil, unable to stand the bloodshed. The voices of the dead filled the mountains, and the memories of those who had perished unfairly murmured in the soil. As if every drop of blood required an accounting, the land itself appeared contaminated and cursed by the sins committed upon it. In a desperate attempt to gain power, men invoked the names of ghosts and shadows and offered sacrifices to strange forces. They burned incense to gain favor from beings who promised them protection and strength, not to honor the Creator. The foundation of altars was fear rather than righteousness, and the smoke rising from them carried cries for dominance rather than prayers of thanks. The reverence that was once shown to heaven was redirected toward idols and false deities, upending the spiritual order. Once regarded with awe, the stars were now mapped for control, their motions examined not to glorify the Creator, but to influence destiny. Originally given as gifts to mark the passage of time, the moon and the sun were later worshipped. The earth and heavens were out of balance, and where truth had once thrived, corruption now ruled. The giants themselves were elevated to the status of gods. Because of their immense size and unparalleled strength, men bowed down to them out of fear of punishment for resisting. They called for sacrifices of blood, livestock, and food. Many gave up their allegiance and referred to these creatures as masters and lords because they felt that opposing them would be pointless. But during their rule, there was no kindness. They took pleasure in brutality, turning suffering into a sport and finding entertainment in suffering. Others would tear animals apart for amusement, leaving carcasses to rot in the fields, and some would uproot trees not for construction, but to show off their strength. Their rage was destructive, instantly destroying homes and scattering lives, and their laughter was terrifying, resonating like thunder. Both literally and figuratively, the earth moaned under their weight. Even the creatures of the waters and the beasts of the field were corrupted. It is said that the order of creation itself was distorted by the Unnachu, rare union of beings and the mixing of bloodlines. Strange creatures roamed the earth, twisted and monstrous, and animals no longer bred after their kind. Beasts with strange shapes, sea creatures with human-like forms, and birds with animal faces all roamed the earth. Chaos took the place of harmony, and the natural order established at the beginning was defiled. Terrification resulted from the blurring of the lines separating one creature from another. The influence of the Watchers and their descendants spread like a disease, despite the earth's apparent resistance to this corruption. Amidst the cacophony of corruption, the voices of the few righteous people were hardly audible. Though they were few in number and their cries were overpowered by the din of evil, there were still men who remembered the Creator and made an effort to live by the rules of justice. As they watched the land around them fall into ruin, they lived as strangers in their own world. The giants hunted some, while their neighbors who worshipped false gods and sorcery made fun of others. They believed that their cries were not forgotten, so despite their suffering, they raised their prayers to heaven. The angels were moved to intervene by their voices, which pierced the heavens along with the cries of the oppressed. The earth was corrupted in both visible and invisible ways. Men's minds were gloomy, violent fantasies. Humility gave way to pride, generosity to greed, and love to lust. Man's very heart had changed from gratitude to resentment, from trust to fear, and from reverence to rebellion. Even though the giants represented the outward manifestation of corruption, a more profound deterioration was occurring within people's hearts. The very foundation of creation was in danger of being destroyed by this corruption of spirit, because every action that follows bears the weight of destruction when a person's heart drifts away from its creator. The earth, which was originally intended to be a place of harmony and life, now appeared to be in ruins. Rivers ran red, fields were barren, cities fell apart, and the sky appeared to be heavy with grief. The corruption had become so pervasive that it had reached every nook and cranny. It was a world changed by the decisions of beings who went from obedience to defiance, from reverence to corruption, rather than by a natural disaster. The soil itself appeared to be holding its breath for the day when justice would mend the damage caused by wickedness. One man stood out in a violent world where corruption permeated every aspect of human existence. His life glowed like a lone candle flickering in a storm, and his name was Noah. Noah lived with a heart that pursued righteousness, in contrast to those around him who had given in to cruelty, greed, and the perverted teachings of the Watchers. His days were characterized by quiet devotion to the Creator rather than by lust for power or bloodshed. Because his soul remained rooted in purity, the whispers of darkness that tempted others seemed to pass over him. Noah stood out in a generation where it seemed like every thought was geared toward violence because his heart was geared toward peace. Noah witnessed the same horrors that beset humanity, so he was not immune to the world's misery. He saw the groaning of the earth under the weight of injustice, the cries of women grieving for their children, and giants wandering the land. Whereas others succumbed to hopelessness, Noah looked up at the sky. His prayers arose as calm dialogues with the one who still possessed the earth and the heavens, rather than as frantic demands. He lived as though he were seen, not as though he was helpless, and as though he was safe. The Creator was aware of this silent power. Noah's face turned toward the light in a world where everyone else's face. Seas turned away, and the courts of heaven saw his devotion. Noah was still mortal and imperfect, so his purity was not as perfect as people may believe. His desire to walk with God when others fled from him, however, was what made him unique. Even at the expense of obedience, his heart yearned for it. Even when truth was ridiculed, his thoughts lingered on it. Even when dishonesty could yield greater profits more quickly, his hands sewed and built with integrity. He instilled in his kids a discipline of reverence rather than corrupt practices. In the midst of chaos, his house felt like a tiny haven where people could pray, sing songs of thanks, and remember the Creator's name. Noah's house remained a lamp that would not go out, even though the outside world grew darker. Noah came from a line that still remembered the old faith, so this distinction was no coincidence. His great-grandfather Enoch had once been so close to God that he was taken into the Almighty's presence and did not taste death. Although many had buried it under the clamor of corruption, that legacy had not been forgotten. Parts of that ancient reverence had been transmitted through Noah's father Lamech and grandfather Methuselah. Noah clung to the memory of his ancestors' devotion, carrying within him the spark of a lineage that had not entirely given up while others had abandoned it. He served as evidence that the root was still alive, much like the final green shoot on a tree that others believed to be dead. Noah's name was uttered when heaven gazed down at the earth and saw destruction extending from horizon to horizon. Noah's prayers rose like incense to the angels who had witnessed the cries of humanity rise, the grotesqueness of giants consuming men, and the wickedness of unending bloodshed. They saw a man who refused to worship idols or refer to the giants as gods, a man who had not been corrupted by the intoxication of forbidden knowledge. His faith served as evidence that morality could endure amidst a sea of immorality. Noah was thus selected by the Almighty Council because of his faithfulness rather than his wealth, strength, or influence. Noah was viewed favorably by the Creator. Mercy found its vessel in him, while judgment was getting ready to purify the earth. Noah was selected because his heart was low enough to submit, not because he was strong enough to withstand the giants or intelligent enough to outsmart the Watcher's corruption. He was prepared to walk in the light when others chose to walk in the dark, to listen when others became deaf, and to trust when others questioned. He was unique because of his personality and unadulterated devotion. He became a reminder that the earth was not completely lost, and a symbol of hope during a period when hope was all but lost. Noah might have appeared normal to his neighbors. Like any other man, he walked the village's paths, tended to his family, and tilled the land. However, beneath that unassuming exterior was a soul in harmony with the heavens. His obedience, not his words, but his integrity, were what made him strong, not his size. Despite being ridiculed by some for not participating in corruption, he maintained his integrity and carried himself with gentleness. When he had the blessing of the Almighty, he didn't require the consent of people. The presence of faith, rather than the lack of trouble, was what brought him peace. He was not immune to the misery caused by the corruption all around him. When he saw injustice, his heart ached. As he saw children develop into cruel beings under the watchful eyes of giants, he lamented the loss of innocence. Even as he grieved, he held on to faith despite the despair that weighed heavily on his generation. His cries turned into prayers and offerings to God. In a way, Noah carried the burden of his time, not as someone who was oblivious to evil, but rather as someone who carried its weight before the heavenly throne. His virtue was perseverance in the face of evil, not a lack of awareness of it. Noah was not only selected by the Almighty to live, but also to serve as the conduit for the preservation of life. His faith's sturdiness and his obedience's endurance would be put to the test by the task that lay ahead. Noah was picked for a journey that would require all of his qualities: reputation, hard work, patience, and trust. Rather than one that would be simple, he would bear the burden of saving future generations. However, Noah's life demonstrated his readiness even before that calling was made clear. He was ready for the day when heaven's command would enter his everyday life and alter the course of history because of his quiet devotion, modest reverence, and unwavering faith. When the earth turned into an enemy, heaven found a friend in Noah. When men had turned into rebels, the Almighty saw a servant in Noah. While the world was drowning in violence, mercy found a home in Noah. His life served as evidence that a single, God-centered heart could shine brightly even in the most impoverished generations. And in that one heart, the Creator discovered a reason to protect the planet and to write a new chapter in life following the impending flood of judgment. As the world collapsed under its own corruption, Noah's name, whispered in heaven, held out hope that it would soon materialize in an ark constructed via faith and obedience. The command arrived like thunder, not with sound, but with force. No one had ever thought that Noah would be tasked by the Almighty with creating a ship large enough to transport life through waters that would submerge the planet. Each measurement was presented to him like a sacred pattern, and the instructions were clear and unambiguous rather than whispered. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, the ark's frame was supposed to rise like a wooden mountain. Its outer shell was to be sealed with pitch to prevent water from penetrating, and its interior was to be divided into decks and compartments. The command seemed overwhelming to Noah, who had never witnessed rivers rise to engulf the land or rainfall in torrents. His heart, however, remained unwavering. He bent his head and readied his hands for work where others would have questioned or argued. He started with timber, cutting down trees with towering trunks that reached the sky, the valley reverberating with every blow of his axe. Since Noah was neither a shipbuilder nor a man who lived close to the sea, his neighbors thought the sound was odd. They thought the ark was crazy, a building without an ocean to sail on or a river to rest in. Nevertheless, Noah labored day after day, carefully shaping beams, smoothing planks, and binding them. As he lifted and positioned, measured and fastened, each piece set in accordance with the divine instruction he had received, a drop of sweat dropped from his brow. This was a work of faith as much as skill, because every blow he made with his tool was an act of obedience to the invisible command of heaven. People gathered to watch as the building started to rise. They initially had innocent curiosity about what their odd neighbor was trying to do. However, as the ark's size increased, interest gave way to mockery. More than the sound of Noah's laughter reverberated among them. They referred to him as stupid and made fun of him for squandering his life on a fantasy. Some shouted insults as they went by, openly jeering. Others told stories about Noah's insanity, spreading them throughout the villages. Elders shook their heads, dismissing him as a man who had lost his mind, while children pointed and laughed. To them, the ark represented a fool's monument rather than a means of salvation. Noah didn't respond to ridicule with ridicule. His hands did not stop their work, nor did his lips form sharp words. His patience served as his shield, and his silence as his strength. He just looked back at the wood in front of him, driving pegs, tightening beams, and laying pitch along the seams when his neighbors made fun of him. The roar of laughter did not sway his faith. It was sufficient that he had heard a voice higher than human voices. His perseverance served as a silent rebuke and evidence that obedience is unaffected by popular opinion. Days turned into years, and the ark grew larger and larger until it was impossible to ignore its imposing presence. Its height loomed over the roofs of houses, and its shadow swept the earth. Nevertheless, the populace refused to accept it. They questioned Noah about the source of the waters that would fill his enormous vessel. They mocked him by claiming that the rivers had never swelled so much and the skies had never opened. They accused him of inciting fear and ridiculed his warnings that judgment was imminent. Noah's response, however, was consistently the same, not indignant but calm. The Creator of heaven and earth had spoken, and what he had said would undoubtedly happen. His family stood by him in faith and helped with the work. His sons learned obedience in the rhythm of labor, spread pitch, lifted beams, and carried timber. His wife and daughters-in-law filled water jars, dried fruits, and stored grain as part of their provision preparation. Their family became a symbol of solidarity as they united against the barrage of derision from the outside. Noah's family was unwavering in their devotion to the God who had selected them for this task, as well as to their father and husband. While others faltered, they were able to persevere because of the same faith that burned within their hearts. The ark itself was more than just a box made of pitch and wood. It was a representation of both mercy and judgment etched into the landscape. Its size signaled that the impending flood was a disaster intended to rid the planet of immorality. However, its doors proclaimed mercy because they were open to anyone who would listen, repent, and seek safety from their immorality. Nevertheless, the crowd chuckled. The call to repentance was not as appealing to them as the comfort of their sins. For them, the sound of hammers no longer signaled salvation, but rather foolishness. Every day, Noah's patience was put to the test. The years were long, the work was hard, and the burden of mockery was heavy. But he persisted because his faith was based on what his heart believed rather than what his eyes saw. The one who had spoken would not lie, he knew. Every day of derision only served to confirm that people's hearts were blind and that their corruption had reached its peak. Noah saw evidence of impending judgment in their laughter. He could see why the flood was required in their rejection. His perseverance was a sign of his faith in God's justice as well as his willpower. Even those who made fun of the ark were amazed by its size as it was completed. It was low, higher than the eye could see at once, with more compartments than anyone could count and beams higher than houses. It served as a haven for a variety of animals rather than just one family. As instructed, Noah set it up, making areas for food, animals, and provisions. Because he understood that salvation was God's design, not his own, he built according to the divine blueprint rather than his own. Those who had ridiculed him now had no justification, because the towering, indisputable proof of his faith was in front of them. Even so, they wouldn't turn. They had closed their ears and hardened their hearts. They opted for mockery over humility and laughter over repentance. As a result, the ark served as a witness that those who died had made their own decisions, as well as an invitation and a judgment. Every day of work was a prayer for Noah. Every hammer blow was a hymn, and every beam raised was an offering. In addition to being made of wood, the ark was also made of faith. It was a testament to obedience, a statement that one man's faith in God could withstand the derision of a whole generation. Noah stayed calm despite the storm-like echoes of laughter all around him, because he knew that another storm was on the horizon, one that would be of waters rather than words, one that would silence all jeering voices when the heavens finally opened. For people who lived beneath it, the sky had always been a place of peace. It was a canopy that extended infinitely above the ground, full of stars, clouds, and the constant light of the moon at night and the sun at day. However, that serenity was shattered at one point. The air became heavy, and the heavens themselves started to move and shake, as if something great was going to fall. Just before the first drop fell, there was a gloomy silence, as though the very act of creation was holding its breath. Then the heavens exploded with a suddenness that shook even the hardest hearts, and water poured down in unprecedented torrents. The first streams of rain soaked the soil, pounded the ground, and swiftly turned dust into mud. Then, as though the windows of heaven had been opened, the streams turned into rivers that poured down from the sky. The sound of rain filled people's ears everywhere. It was violent, relentless, and never-ending. It was not the soft, rhythmic patter that farmers used to love for their fields. Roofs were unable to contain its force. Within hours, streets became rushing waters. Those who had once made fun of Noah stood in confusion, looking up, unable to comprehend the overwhelming force that was falling upon them. They might have initially assumed it would end swiftly, a storm similar to others they had witnessed. However, it continued. The rain kept coming, unrelenting, and the water beneath the ground rushed up to join the torrents from above. Deep in the earth, springs and fountains erupted, spitting water onto the ground. Plains were engulfed by rising floods. Valleys turned into basins, and rivers overflowed their banks. The ark, large and stable, with its wooden frame sealed and fastened long before the first drops had started to fall, stood in the center of this mayhem. It had served as a mocking symbol for years. In an area without a sea, they chuckled at the elderly man who was hammering and sawing, working non-stop on something so massive. However, the ark now stood as the sole haven, its lofty sides slicing through raindrops like a fortress built by divine decree rather than human design. Noah and his family were safe inside, as were all the creatures. The doors had been closed and sealed by the one who had given the order to build them, not by human hands. But panic broke out like wildfire outside. Clinging to trees, rocks, and anything else that might provide a means of escape from the unrelentingly rising waters, families hurried to higher ground. The roar of the rain and the rumbling of waters crashing through fields and forests blended with their cries. Desperate to keep their children above the rising flood, parents gripped their kids tightly. When strong men attempted to swim, the current mercilessly dragged them down. Herds of animals ran away, following their instincts toward the mountains, only to discover that the waters rose more quickly than their tired legs could support them. The once fertile and vibrant earth was becoming a restless ocean that was destroying everything that had been created by human hands, erasing landmarks and engulfing houses. The cries that reverberated outside the wooden walls must have been heard by Noah, who was inside the ark. For years, he had been warning them to see the truth and to turn away from corruption. Rather than laughter, those voices now carried fear. The same voices that had mocked him begged desperately, but there was no more time for pity. A world that had chosen violence, rebellion, and pride over the path of righteousness was being judged by heaven, and the floodwaters were more than just a natural disaster. Justice had come, as evidenced by every sound of water crashing against the ark's side and every hushed cry outside its sealed walls. The rain did not lessen as the days went by. Day after day, night after night, it fell with the same unrelenting force. The waters surged past the tallest trees, swept through villages, and climbed over hills. Towers sank into the abyss, bridges were ripped apart, and massive stone structures fell. The fundamental underpinnings of human confidence were undermined. When confronted with the Creator's judgment, everything that had appeared stable, cities, armies, wealth, and power, turned out to be brittle. As the waters ascended toward their summits, even mountains, symbols of power and permanence, seemed insignificant. The animals in the ark shifted uneasily as their instincts picked up on the catastrophe outside. The rising flood, however, kept the ship steady. The ark did not falter despite waves pushing against its sides because it had been purposefully designed, measured, and guided by divine instruction. The ark was raised higher, away from the devastation below, by the same waters that destroyed the world. A profound truth was revealed in this paradox. Mercy and judgment flowed together. Noah and his family survived the same flood that swept others away, while the earth was being purified of impurities. Every day there were fewer human cries. Shouts, cries, and desperate cries gave way to silence, which was only interrupted by the never-ending thunderclap of the water. Cities and villages that once throbbed with life were hidden beneath the waves, forgotten and unseen. There was no sign of the abundance that once fed nations as fields of crops disappeared under the flood. Uprooted by the force of the currents, forests drifted aimlessly on the surface like broken pieces of a world gone to pieces. The highest mountains' peaks were all that was left to see, and even these became smaller as the waters rose higher. Every hour spent in the ark must have been a mixture of fear and wonder for Noah and his family. The sound of rushing water surrounded them on all sides. Lightning pierced through the thick curtains of rain, and thunder shook the skies above. However, there was also an odd serenity inside the wooden walls. In contrast to the chaos outside, there was a rhythm created by the presence of both large and small animals, the dim light coming through tiny openings, and the steady creaking of wood against the waves. They were safe because they obeyed the order they were given, not because they were strong. The earth had responded with fountains from its depths, and the heavens had shattered open. The forces from above and below worked together to reverse the corruption. The flood was not haphazard, it was intentional, overwhelming, and precise. It served as a reminder that everything in the universe is the property of its creator, and that the elements submit to his commands. Rain did not fall endlessly for no cause. Rather, it fell because the world had passed a threshold, and purification was the only way to fix it. Until the earth's whole surface was covered, the waters persisted without stopping. Time must have seemed to stop inside the ark. With only the sound of water to indicate the passage of time, days melted into nights and nights into days. Although Noah and his family were unable to see what was going on outside the walls, they could sense the rise, the sway, the movements, and the pressure of judgment. They were promised preservation, but they had no idea when the rain would stop. As the sky continued to pour its flood above them and the deep continued to release its hidden waters below, they waited amid the echoes of a world being undone. The earth itself appeared to disappear beneath an endless sea as the waters grew higher and higher, engulfing plains, hills, and valleys. The Nephilim, the tall figures who once frightened people, were ensnared in a force that was stronger than themselves. These giants had walked the earth with a sense of pride, their appetites consuming entire nations, their footsteps trembling the earth. They had ruled brutally, taking pleasure in bloodshed and instilling fear wherever they went. However, regardless of their size, strength, or fear, the very waters that poured from the sky and exploded from the ground now surged against them. Their height was a disadvantage for the first time. Rivers they once easily controlled became raging seas that pulled them down, and mountains they once stood upon became islands that vanished under the tide. As children of rebellion, born from the union of mortal women and the Watchers, the Nephilim had thought of themselves as unbeatable. They lived longer than human generations, had enormous bodies, and were stronger than regular men. To satisfy their ravenous appetite, entire tribes had bowed before them, offering food, livestock, and even their lives. They had been lords of destruction and kings of violence. However, their power lost all meaning when the waters arrived. As if they could battle the ocean itself, their enormous arms thrashed against the escalating flood, slamming into waves. With their massive hands clawing at rocky slopes, they attempted to scale the highest mountain's peaks, but the waters rose even faster, engulfing ridge after ridge. Cries of anger and terror mixed with the thunder and storm's roar as their roars reverberated throughout the flood. Those who had previously seen the Nephilim shuddered in their presence, but now their frailty was exposed by the sight of these majestic creatures battling against judgment. As the giants that had once terrorized their villages now flailed helplessly, mothers held their children closer. Once hiding in caves to avoid their anger, men now watched as the waves ate them up. Perhaps it was true that the proud Nephilim had thought they could not be destroyed by human hands. However, they had never taken the heavenly decree into consideration. Water, the silent, formless servant of the Creator, drowned their pride and dragged them down to depths they could not reach, but no blade forged by man could kill them. A few giants used their strength to try to resist. As if their strength could stop the flood, they waded into the torrents and lifted boulders to create barriers. However, their efforts were easily washed away by the water, rendering even their greatest strength useless. Others dove into the water, swimming with strokes that were quicker than any beast at slicing through the waves. The flood, however, was not like any other river or sea. It rose with a purpose and surged indefinitely, leaving no room for rest. Even the strongest of them grew weary, their muscles straining, their enormous lungs burning, until exhaustion pulled them down. The waters offered no safety, and the earth had no more space for them. When the Nephilim realized their fate, their cries resounded. Once commanding and frightening, their deep voices now carried desperation. Calling out to the Watchers who had fathered them, they yelled into the sky, but the angels were likewise bound in judgment. There was no rescue. The only sound in the heavens was the constant rain. The Nephilim were left to die in the judgment that engulfed their world, and the Watchers' relationship with their offspring was broken. They were the result of their rebellion, but it was unable to protect them from the justice it had sparked. Earth's cruel rulers met the same fate as the people they oppressed. The same judgment erased them as they sank beneath the same waters, carried by the same currents. The strong and the weak, the tall and the small, the farmer and the warrior were all the same in the flood. All who had strayed from righteousness were devoured by the waters, which showed no favoritism. However, because the Nephilim had been the very embodiment of corruption on earth, their demise carried a special weight. Their demise signified the purification of the corruption that their presence had fostered, which had included terror, violence, and hopelessness. Later, rumors circulated about how some giants attempted to hang on to treetops in their last moments, their arms encircling branches that bowed and snapped under their weight. Others scaled to the highest ridges, their heads briefly still looming over the waves, only to see the flood rise even higher, until even their crowns vanished beneath the water. Desperate for a foothold, some might have squabbled among themselves as the waters dragged them down, clawing at each other. Their tragic demise demonstrated that the will of heaven is greater than the might of the flesh. Although Noah and his family were inside the ark, they were aware of what was happening even though they were unable to witness the giant's fall. Enough was said by the sound of the waves and the quiet of the outside world. Once consuming humanity, the Nephilim were now consumed. Noah's family may have been deeply saddened by the loss of these creatures, who were once children of wonder before they were corrupted, as well as by the common people who perished in the flood. Because even though they were vicious and terrifying, their existence was still a tragedy brought about by rebellion. Not entirely human, nor entirely angelic, they had been torn between two worlds and duos, med, from the moment of conception. Their enormous bodies were carried into the depths by the waters, and the flood turned into their grave. They were buried without a monument, and their names were not written on a tombstone. Once crushed under their weight, the earth was now free of their presence. The memory of their fear washed away with the waves as they rolled over their remains. The post-flood world would no longer shudder under their feet. Beyond the drowning of giants, the end of the Nephilim marked the end of a reign of terror that had left humanity scarred. It marked the end of a period when violence and corruption had ruled the planet. Their strength had appeared to last forever, but it was ultimately destroyed by the Almighty's decree. No weapon could penetrate their enormous bodies, which sank into the depths like stones and never came back up. Once a source of life for the planet, the waters turned into a tool for their demise, sweeping them into obscurity and wiping their shadows from the territory they once controlled. Their memory persisted in the stillness of the earth even after the rain stopped and the waters subsided. In order to warn future generations of what happens when creation rebels against its creator, those who survived inside the ark would tell of them, their brutality, and their demise. Their demise was more than just a historical event. It was a lesson etched into human memory and a warning inscribed in silence and water. The flood that carried the Nephilim into eternity was the cause of their demise, not conflict or human strength. When the Watchers first descended to Mount Hermon, they could not have predicted the judgment that would fall upon them. They were now under the crushing weight of divine wrath, having once been radiant beings who had walked among the heavens. They had fallen in arrogance, thinking that their defiance of divine order and their promises of unity would protect them from punishment. They had created giants who tainted the planet, taught humanity forbidden arts, and unleashed a wave of violence that terrorized the entire world. There would be no way out now that it was time for their own reckoning. The powerful angels of judgment purposefully descended when the decree was issued. Protectors of order and purity, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and Uriel arrived as tools of the Almighty's will. Their arrival served as a reminder that even the greatest rebellion cannot override the laws of heaven, like fire piercing through darkness. Once brave and fearless, the Watchers now shuddered in the presence of the faithful. They had pictured themselves as Earth's rulers, but now they were merely shivering prisoners, waiting for the verdict that would end their lives. Unbreakable chains appeared, woven from divine command itself rather than forged by human hands or composed of any earthly metal. Designed to hold spirits that once soared among the stars, these bonds were living judgments that could not be broken. At first, the Watchers fought back, their cries reverberating across the devastated landscapes as their enormous bodies fought against the hold of condemnation. However, resistance served no purpose. As he struggled against the inevitable, Michael himself bound their leader, Semjaza, and cast him down. The chains that wound around his body like serpents of light folded his once powerful wings, symbols of freedom, against him and locked them. Once inciting rebellion, his voice now erupted into frantic cries that vanished into the unending stillness of divine decree. The first illustration of their fate was Azazel, who had already been apprehended and placed in captivity. He was buried under weight that no strength could lift, thrown into the dark beneath jagged stones, and bound hand and foot. His screams were absorbed by the depths and turned into a fa, far-off echo. The watchers fell into the abyss after him, one by one. Previously uttered by mortals in awe and terror, their names were now only used as warnings. The same fate befell Barakiel, Kokabil, Penamu, and Serial. Once glittering in men's eyes, the knowledge they had passed on had become poison. They would be punished forever for their betrayal, which had condemned them. The abyss was not like any prison on the planet. It was a huge, empty space beneath creation itself, cut off from light and life, rather than a dungeon made of stone or iron. There was only darkness that went on forever, silence so heavy it pressed against the soul, and no sun to mark day or moon to soften night. The watchers were flung here, their bodies bound in ways that are incomprehensible to the human mind. Unable to rise or stretch, they were trapped beneath sharp rocks and sucked into narrow, deep caverns. Their strength was squandered against the unforgiving grasp of judgment, and their wings, which had once been their pride, were bound against them. Their cries did not reverberate throughout the earth or reach the heavens. The sound itself was swallowed by the abyss, leaving behind a void of silence that heightened their desperation. There, time flowed differently. Moments stretched like centuries, and ages went by like moments. They were aware that they would never again be able to walk the earth, see the sky, or experience freedom. Darkness blinded their eyes, which had been used to starlight. Their voices, which once had the ability to influence entire countries, were diminished to cries of remorse and curses directed at their own foolishness. The greatest burden of guilt fell on Semjaza, who had led them into rebellion. His thoughts went back to the time they took their oath together on Mount Hermon, uniting to carry out their defiance. What had once seemed like bravery now seemed like insanity. This never-ending prison was the result of the desire for mortal daughters, the promise of power, and the need to be worshipped. He recalled the pride of witnessing humanity bow before their gifts, the excitement of imparting knowledge that was forbidden, and their laughter as they descended. That laughter had now become hollow cries, reverberating in his own mind as unending agony. The abyss turned into a mirror and a prison for the watchers. They were compelled to face their actions in the quiet. They were burdened by every rumor of violence, every spell cast, and every weapon raised by human hands as a result of their instruction. They were unable to forget the violence of the Nephilim, the destroyed lives, and the burned cities. Once disregarded, humanity's cries now echoed inside their chains. Their own memories turned into chains as powerful as those encircling their limbs, and it seemed as though the earth itself testified against them. Some, however, held on to the hope of release despite their desperation. They reasoned that their punishment might only last a short while. One day, perhaps, mercy would extend all the way to the bottom. However, the ruling had been unambiguous. They would continue to be bound until the great day of judgment. Their release would be contingent upon final sentencing, when all forms of rebellion would be considered rather than freedom. Only the crushing knowledge of eternity remained after that hope, brittle and far away, flickered like a dying flame. Life slowly started to change above the ground. A new chapter in human history began when the waters subsided and Noah's Ark set, led on the mountains. Far below the surface, however, the watchers were still ensnared in silence. The weight of divine justice buried their rebellion, sealing their doom. Their names would be forgotten by the world above, but their chains remained on the earth. They were reminded that they were still imprisoned until the designated day by every tremor and deep rumble beneath the mountains, which could be interpreted as the restless stirring of their prison. They could not die, so the abyss became their tomb, but not their final resting place. Everlasting creatures cursed with unending consciousness, they bore their penalty awake, never sleeping, never dying. They lost both their identity and their freedom when they fell. They were now prisoners, broken, silent, and awaiting judgment. They were no longer lords of forbidden wisdom or watchers of the heavens. Therefore, they continue to exist beneath creation, unheard and unseen but not forgotten. They wait for the hour when all rebellion will be brought to light for a final reckoning, bound in darkness and bound in chains made by divine command. Their tale endures not as a triumph but as a warning. Those who desert their place and corrupt the gifts of heaven will find no rest except the abyss beneath the earth. Knowledge is a unique gift. It creates connections between generations, molds the world, and gives human endeavor purpose. However, depending on how it is used, it can either warm or destroy, much like fire. Knowledge was basic in the early days of humanity when we were all innocent. How to sow seeds, how to gather food, and how to sing heart-lifting songs. However, that purity was destroyed when forbidden wisdom fell into human hands. The world started to feel the weight of knowledge that was never supposed to be carried, and what had once been a means of progress turned into a weapon. In addition to bringing gifts that initially appeared miraculous, the Watchers had come with desire in their hearts. The understanding of stars, cycles, and hidden forces seemed like a gateway to the divine to a people who gazed at the heavens with wonder and mystery. The secrets of paint, jewelry, and enchantments seemed like treasures to women who wore flowers as adornments in the past. The forging of blades seemed a new strength to men who hunted game and tilled the land. However, these teachings gradually swayed human hearts away from harmony and in the direction of destruction. Humanity was consumed by the forbidden arts, not elevated. Azazel's weapons, which were supposed to be symbols of power, ended up being instruments of violence. Tribes engaged in never-ending cycles of retaliation. Brothers brandished knives against one another, and disagreements that had previously been resolved verbally descended into bloody rivers. Every time a sword was raised, the lesson became more profound. Unbridled power leads to destruction. Iron and bronze brought death quickly, leaving behind widows, orphans, and broken homes where men used to fight with stones and fists. The ground itself soaked with blood, pleading for justice with the heavens. Semjaza's spells and charms gave the appearance of control over invisible powers. Humanity resorted to rituals that shackled their souls rather than looking up in trust. Though it came with deceit, the knowledge of enchantments promised luck, health, and love. People clung to whispered incantations, thinking they could change fate, and forgot the simplicity of faith. However, what they believed to be strength turned into bondage, and soon fear overtook freedom. Unstoppable, the forbidden knowledge spread like fire across dry grass, taking root in every city and village. At first glance, Barakiel's gift of the stars appeared innocuous. Yes, the beauty of the constellations glimmering in the night sky is undeniable. However, men gave up their will once they started tracking their lives based on the motion of the stars. They believed that their fate was predetermined by lights they hardly comprehended, and they no longer lived by free will but by patterns etched above them. Merchants risked their fortunes by relying on celestial signs. Kings used constellations to decide whether to go to war or peace, and lovers bound themselves by horoscopes rather than promises. What started out as wonder devolved into a web of fatalism, depriving humanity of accountability for its own decisions. Even more significant was Penemu's talent as a writer. Once as ephemeral as the breath that carried them, words were now permanently carved into stone and etched into clay. Writing carried wisdom from one age to the next, documented laws, and preserved memory. However, it also perpetuated lies, hatred, and curses. Previously, disagreements could be forgotten over time, but now resentments were recorded, recalled, and transmitted. Words evolved into blade-sharp weapons that could injure people for generations. Even though writing had the potential to create a wealth of knowledge, corruption turned it into yet another destructive tool. Over time, humanity gained mastery thanks to Serial's moon revelations. Men started to sow and reap precisely after they learned about the seasons and months. Journeys were planned, festivals were marked, and life's rhythms were made predictable. However, the same information that ought to have directed thankfulness was perverted into hierarchical structures. Calendars were used by leaders to manipulate the course of events, enforce rituals, and demand tribute at predetermined times. Even the moon's beauty, which was supposed to symbolize periods of introspection, was used as a weapon of contrition. Humanity was further ensnared by knowledge that could have established order. The earth became unbalanced when all of these lessons were combined. Instead of coexisting peacefully with creation, humanity now aimed to control, manipulate, and take advantage of it. Knowledge was now a master rather than a servant. The skies lamented the perversion of stars, the waters carried the cries of those slain unfairly, and the ground witnessed the misuse of iron. The weight of forbidden wisdom appeared to have scarred even the mountains and trees. Once a glimmer of light, knowledge had turned into a devouring fire. Living evidence of what corrupted knowledge could produce were the Nephilim themselves. Their reign reflected unbridled power, their appetites endless, and their strength unparalleled. They represented the peril of knowledge separated from wisdom, since they were born into a forbidden union and brought up with forbidden teachings. They turned the gift of life into a nightmare, ate up the land, and crushed the weak. They were giants of corruption as well as giants of flesh, a testament to the devastation that results from misusing divine gifts. Though not everyone took it to heart, humanity gained a painful lesson from it all. Unbridled knowledge breeds destruction. The way knowledge was applied was bad, not knowledge per se. It had the potential to preserve life, foster beauty, and create peace in the hands of the faithful. However, it turned into a root of death and chains in the hands of the arrogant and disobedient. Once twisted, even the smallest secrets have the power to destroy generations and bring down entire kingdoms. The scars of forbidden knowledge persisted even after heaven responded to the earth's cries. At this point in time, humanity had to decide whether to respect the limits established by their creator or to keep pursuing abilities that damaged their souls. Much of the corruption was washed away by the flood, but remnants of those teachings persisted, passed down from father to son in customs and practices that withstood the test of time. The mistakes of the Watchers would be repeated in later times when nations, kings, and magicians would still strive for secrets they were never supposed to possess. The most important lesson learned from this was that knowledge is never neutral. It molds destinies, guides societies, and shapes hearts. When applied modestly, it can draw people nearer to God. When misused with arrogance, it has the power to destroy the entire world. Not all secrets are meant to be understood. Not all doors are meant to be opened, and not all flames should be touched, as the tale of the Watchers and the Nephilim became ingrained in human memory. Because what transpired during the times of rebellion and judgment was not recorded for a single generation or preserved in the archives of ancient history, shadows linger over the memory of ages. It was a message that reached far into the future, reminding people of the fine line that separates obedience from defiance in every country, language, and time. The story of the Watchers and their demise became a warning that reverberated in the very breath of creation, reverberating in wind whispers, floods, storms, and the consciences of those who dared to pursue the truth. The record of corruption, justice, and mercy would be as clear as the sun rising after an endless night of darkness, as if heaven had sealed time itself. The corruption that swept the planet was not limited to the pre-flood era. Its stain demonstrated how easily humanity could destroy peace and unleash chaos when equipped with knowledge that had been misguided. The subsequent generations were never intended to view those times as a remote myth, but rather as a window into human nature. Because there have been giants in every age, not just in terms of size, but also in terms of pride, strength, and disobedience. and the results of disregarding the Creator's limits have been seen throughout history. In addition to being a final chapter, the destruction of the Nephilim and the Watcher's imprisonment served as a constant reminder that no wisdom, no secret, and no strength can endure when taken away from its source. The testimony of Noah and his rescue was also intended to endure beyond the actual flood. His moral rectitude and unwavering commitment served as a beacon of light that endured beyond his generation. Noah is a silent, steadfast, and chosen figure who stands tall in every storm that nations encounter and in every wave of corruption that rises against innocence. Rising above the waters, his ark represented more than just wood and pitch. It was a place of safety for everyone who believes in the Creator's will, regardless of how many people criticize them or how hopeless salvation may appear. Not just his children would hear his story, but innumerable generations who would follow in his footsteps and face their own setbacks. The Watchers binding beneath the earth symbolized both their punishment and the assurance that divine justice never sleeps. They had been strong, admired by men, and feared for their strength, but their chains serve as a constant reminder that no uprising is permanent. They stay imprisoned until the appointed day when judgment will once more be fully revealed, hidden beneath mountains and valleys, in locations invisible to the naked eye. Theirs is a sentence that looms large, demonstrating that every action, every abuse of power and privilege has consequences that go beyond the immediate. The clinking chains in the shadowy corners of the earth are not just theirs. They are echoes that serve to remind people that pride always leads to imprisonment. This shadow also confines knowledge. The Watcher's teachings, the secrets never intended for human hands, the forbidden arts, serve as metaphors for what happens when wisdom and knowledge are separated. After the flood, generations would come and go, with some learning and many forgetting that knowledge has two sides. It has the capacity to create, heal, and bless. But when misused, it can be a weapon of oppression, conceit, and devastation. Every age is reminded by the tale of that early corruption that knowledge is like poison concealed in a cup of sweet wine if it is sought without humility and respect. Although the desire for knowledge is admirable, it can drown souls just as surely as the flood did the earth if it is separated from the Creator's direction. For this reason, the shadow of those bygone eras extends to the last hour's horizon. It is a living reminder that is interwoven into the very fabric of human history, rather than just a story that has been preserved for academics or mystics. The steps of those who fell long ago are repeated when people construct towers that reach the sky, when kingdoms rise in haughtiness, and when powers try to mold the earth to suit their wishes. Nothing is concealed from the one who keeps watch over creation, as evidenced by the rebellion of the Watchers, the violence of the Nephilim, and the destruction caused by the flood. His justice is never denied, even though it may appear to be delayed. This memory appears to be etched in the sky itself. When the firmament broke open and waters poured out, the thunder that trembles the heavens is reminiscent of that moment. Mankind is reminded of the flood that once engulfed every mountain by the waves that roar against the shore. Every storm that clouds the sky is a reminder to remember the past. However, these reminders are accompanied by the assurance that those who, like Noah, remain steadfast and faithful will always be able to receive mercy and deliverance. The rainbow that emerges after the rain does more than just decorate the sky. It establishes the covenant that the Creator has not forgotten and will not desert those who put their faith in Him. Thus, the story transcends the status of an ancient record and becomes a prophecy that is interwoven with life itself, because the final judgment is covered by the same shadow that extends back to Noah's time. Generations are forewarned that justice will arrive like fire, just as men once disregarded warnings and drowned. Even though the Watchers are still bound and the Nephilim are destroyed, their fate is not buried in silence. Rather, it is a voice proclaiming that rebellion always ends in disaster, and that mercy is reserved for those who lift their hearts. The narrative of those early days focuses more on the decisions that must be made in each present moment than it does on the past. Thus, the shadow endures through the ages as a somber teacher rather than a terrifying force. It haunts families and kingdoms, both intelligent and stupid. It gently exhorts men to seek wisdom in reverence rather than conceit, to remember and to be humble. It serves as a reminder to humanity that all gifts, powers, and creation secrets are entrusted rather than owned, and both salvation and doom are contained in that trust. Toward the day when the books will be opened, the chains will be released, and justice will once again walk the earth with unwavering steps. The shadow of the past sways closer and closer to the dawn of the future. Until then, the tale continues to be alive, pulsing through time, calling on humanity to pay attention, educate themselves, and tread carefully under the watchful eye of the one who possesses eternity. As if the heavens themselves were breathing in time with the hearts of those who listen, the night descends upon the earth like a soft, unhurried cloak. Like ripples vanishing across a still lake, the voices of the elderly fade into the distance, their echoes softened and no longer heavy or sharp. The silence that follows when justice has spoken and mercy has lingered is all that is left, not the sound of battle or the cries of the fallen. It is a quiet that is reassuring, like the gradual turning of pages in a book that has been in the mind for a long time, leaving behind warmth rather than fear. The now quiet sky turns into a peaceful canvas. The faint glow of the stars serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light has never left the world. They have a steady, patient glow that seems to be waiting for tired eyes to become heavy and give up to rest. Chains, floods, rebellion, and judgment are among the burdens that are carried throughout the narrative, but they start to lessen as the darkness softens. They float away, leaving only peace and quiet, like leaves floating on a still stream. There is a promise in this silence. Even though there have been storms and shadows throughout the story, it ends peacefully rather than in terror, as if the Creator himself is reaching out to hold each listening soul. It is a whispering serenity that serves as a reminder to the heart that there has always been a place of rest, despite the ages of struggle and the rise and fall of giants, a place where trust leads to safety, obedience leads to safety, and even the tiniest glimmer of faith can triumph over storms and floods. As the story plays like a lullaby in your mind, picture yourself lying under the stars, the world around you motionless. Every image fades and every word becomes softer until they are only soft echoes that lead the heart to peace. As if on invisible wings, the soul feels lighter, the breath slows, and the eyes get heavier. Even though the story is long and full of powerful lessons, it now only lingers as a soft presence, like the light from a lamp going out before dawn. Additionally, the story ends with a continuation written in dreams rather than a conclusion as you drift. Because the lessons are silently woven into the fabric of the heart, even when one is at rest. They rest with you, just as stars rest in the sky, waves rest on the beach, and the soul rests in the peace of its Creator. They don't demand anything or startle you. The world feels safe again as the silence grows and the night envelops. Now go to sleep in the silence of this hushed conclusion. Allow the tale to fade into quiet. Allow the echoes to become softer, and allow tranquility to gently embrace you. The story is over, the darkness is gone, and there is nothing but peace. You own the calm, the rest, and the night. And may you find dreams as soft as the stars and as boundless as eternity in that peace.